Thank you for joining in today's cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Throat of the World, and this is a horror story about the Camazotz. And in this story, a wealthy, eccentric cryptozoologist funds a massive expedition of 40 people, specialists, mercenaries, and graduate students into the unexplored depths of the Petén Basin in Guatemala. They aren't looking for a ruin. They are looking for a temple mentioned in fragmented texts as the gateway to Xibalba. They treat the legend of Camazotz as a biological puzzle to be solved, not a deity to be feared. The second story today is called The Threshold of Mashu, and this is a horror story about the Girtablilu. A team of elite archaeology specialists and private security contractors are hired to explore a newly discovered geological anomaly in the Zagros Mountains. The site is a massive, twin-peaked limestone formation that mirrors the mythological Mount Mashu. The client is an occultist billionaire who believes the site is a gateway to the underworld. In the description below, the stories have been time-stamped. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Throat of the World. The sound began not as a scream but as something worse, a wet, rhythmic dismantling, like a butcher working through gristle with a dull blade, each stroke deliberate and unhurried. The digital audio recorder sat on a metal table in a fluorescent-lit laboratory, its waveform display spiking in jagged, irregular peaks that looked less like music and more like the seismograph reading of a collapsing building. The recording had been found in the cargo pocket of a dead man's vest, deep in the Guatemalan jungle, 200 miles from the nearest paved road. The man had been identified as Marcus Reyes, a 34-year-old mercenary and former Marine, whose body had been recovered not from the ground but from the fork of a tree 60 feet above the forest floor. He had been drained of blood. Every vein, every artery, every capillary had been emptied with a precision that no surgical instrument could replicate. The recording was the last thing his device had captured before its battery died. The first 30 seconds were silence, just the ambient hum of the jungle at night, the layered chorus of insects and frogs, and the distant rumble of thunder that never seemed to arrive. Then came the sound. It was not a scream. A scream implies a single, explosive release of air from lungs that are still intact. This was something else. It was the sound of a human throat being systematically taken apart, cartilage popping, tissue tearing, the sickeningly wet flapping of what could only be leather, or skin, or something that wore both like a cloak. Layered beneath it, almost lost in the noise, was the rhythmic pulse of something breathing, not human breathing, but something vast and patient, like a bellows in a forge. Then the voice came. It was distorted, pitched too high, then too low, as if the speaker's vocal cords had already been damaged, as if they were speaking through a throat that was no longer entirely their own. The whisper was barely audible above the wet sounds, but the audio technicians had isolated it, cleaned it, played it back for the investigators in that sterile laboratory, until every syllable was burned into their memory. It doesn't see the light, it sees the heat of our hearts. Then the recording cut to dead silence. Not the silence of a forest, not the silence of a machine being turned off. The silence of something that had been listening and had finally found the person who was speaking. The investigators played it 17 times. On the 17th playback, one of the technicians noticed something that none of them had caught before. In the final 2 seconds of the recording, the dead silence after the whisper, there was a sound. It was so faint, so far below the threshold of normal human hearing that it had been dismissed as background noise. But when they amplified it, when they pushed the gain until the waveform filled the screen, they found it. A click, a single biological click, like a tongue striking the roof of a mouth. And then another, and another. A rapid, staccato burst of clicks that formed a pattern that, when the technicians finally decoded it 3 weeks later, turned out to be an exact acoustic map of the laboratory room they were sitting in. Something had been listening to them through the recording. Something had been mapping them. The recording was classified. The laboratory was shut down. The body of Marcus Reyes was cremated and buried in an unmarked grave. And the name Dr. Aris Thorne was quietly removed from every database, every academic registry, every institutional record, as if the man had never existed. But the jungle remembers what men try to forget. Dr. Aris Thorne was not a man who believed in monsters. He believed in specimens. To him, every myth was a misidentified animal, every legend a garbled taxonomic report passed down through generations who lacked the vocabulary of modern science. The chupacabra was a parasitic bat with an exaggerated range. The yeti was an unclassified primate. The Loch Ness Monster was a deep-water eel with a phenotype that hadn't been documented since the Pleistocene. Every culture, he liked to say over expensive bourbon in his climate-controlled office at the Thorne Institute for Cryptobiological Research, was just a poorly written field guide waiting to be corrected. Thorne was 53 years old, lean and angular, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from a block of hardwood and then left out in the weather. His hair was steel gray, cropped close, and his eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of a man who had spent too many years staring at screens and not enough staring at the sky. He had made his fortune not through academia, but through a biotech startup that he had sold in his late 30s for a sum that allowed him to fund his real passion, the systematic, empirical pursuit of creatures that science said did not exist. The institute was his temple, and its laboratory was its altar, and the specimens, bones, tissue samples, grainy photographs, audio recordings, were its relics. The expedition to the Petén Basin had been 3 years in the planning. Thorne had first encountered the legend of Camazotz as a graduate student, buried in a footnote of a translated Kh text that described a throat of the world. A physical location, not a metaphor, where the barrier between the mortal plane and Xibalba, the Mayan underworld, was thin enough to be crossed. The text was fragmentary, contradictory, and steeped in the kind of poetic mysticism that made most academics dismiss it as allegory. But Thorne had noticed something that the others hadn't. The text contained precise geographical descriptions, distances between landmarks, descriptions of limestone formations and subterranean water sources that matched no known ruin but that were too specific to be invented. Someone had been there. Someone had seen something, and whatever they had seen had made them write it down in a language that was half prayer and half warning. The Thorne Institute assembled a team of 40 people. It was, by any measure, the most well-funded and technologically equipped cryptozoological expedition in history. The roster included 12 graduate students from 3 universities, handpicked by Thorne himself for their expertise in cave biology, acoustics, and Mesoamerican archaeology. It included 8 former special operations mercenaries, contracted through a private security firm that Thorne had used on 3 previous expeditions without incident. It included geologists, a medical team, a logistics coordinator, 2 drone operators, and a film crew that was documenting the expedition for a streaming documentary that Thorne had already sold the distribution rights to. The total cost of the expedition was just north of $4 million, and Thorne paid for it out of his own pocket without blinking. The equipment list read like a military procurement document. 4 thermal imaging drones with a flight time of 90 minutes each, capable of mapping subterranean spaces via infrared. Satellite phones with backup battery arrays, a portable ground-penetrating radar unit, high-grade weaponry for the mercenary detail, FN SCAR assault rifles, Glock 19 sidearms, and enough ammunition to supply a small garrison, rebreather systems for submerged cave passages, climbing gear rated for vertical descents of up to 300 meters, portable environmental sensors capable of detecting trace gases, temperature fluctuations, and bioacoustic signatures, a field laboratory compact enough to fit in 3 hardened cases, and because Thorne was a man who believed in documentation above all else, 46 digital audio recorders, 1 for every member of the team, plus spares, set to record continuously from the moment they left the airstrip. The team gathered in Flores, a small island town in the Petén region of Guatemala, accessible only by a narrow causeway from the mainland. The town was a staging point for tourists visiting the nearby ruins of Tikal, but Thorne's group had no interest in Tikal. Their destination was 70 kilometers southwest, in a region of the basin that had never been surveyed, never been mapped, never been photographed from the ground. Satellite imagery showed it as a featureless expanse of jungle canopy, unbroken by roads or rivers or clearings. But the ground-penetrating radar data that Thorne had commissioned from a private orbital imaging company told a different story. Beneath the canopy, the limestone bedrock was honeycombed with voids, caverns, tunnels, and one structure that was too regular, too geometric to be natural. It was roughly circular, 120 meters in diameter, and it descended at an angle that the imaging analysts described as deliberate. "Someone built something down there," Thorne told the team on the first night, standing in the cramped conference room of the Flores Hotel that he had rented in its entirety. A topographical projection glowed on the wall behind him, the anomaly highlighted in red against the green of the surrounding jungle. The KH texts describe a vertical descent into the earth, a throat that opens into the underworld. For 300 years, scholars have assumed this was a metaphor. The radar says otherwise. He paused, letting the image sink in. The room was warm despite the air conditioning, humid with the Petén's breath, and the projection cast the team's faces in a pale green light that made them all look slightly ill. "We are not here to find a god," Thorne continued. "We are here to find an ecosystem. The legends of Camazotz, the death bat of Mayan mythology, almost certainly derive from an encounter with an unclassified species of chiroptera. Possibly a megachiropteran, possibly something from the Desmodontinae subfamily, the vampire bats. The mythology describes a creature with a wingspan of several meters, obsidian-like claws, and a habit of decapitating its victims. That is not a god. That is a predator that has been misremembered as a deity. Our job is to find it, document it, and bring back evidence that the scientific community cannot ignore." He said this with the calm, clinical certainty of a man who had never been wrong, who had never encountered a specimen that did not fit neatly into a taxonomy, who had never stood in a dark place and felt the architecture of his understanding begin to buckle. The mercenaries exchanged glances. They had heard worse briefings from worse employers, and $4 million bought a lot of confidence. The graduate students took notes. The film crew rolled their cameras, and the jungle, outside the thin walls of the hotel, breathed its slow, ancient breath and said nothing. The first 3 days of the expedition were, by all accounts, uneventful. The team moved through the jungle in a disciplined column, the mercenaries at the front and rear, the scientists in the middle, the equipment distributed across porters and pack frames. The canopy was so thick that direct sunlight never reached the forest floor. They moved in a perpetual green twilight, the air thick enough to taste, heavy with the scent of decay and growth intertwined. The ground was uneven, a treacherous lattice of roots and limestone outcrops that made every step a calculation. Insects swarmed in clouds so dense they were audible, a high, whining drone that became background noise within the first hour. Jordan Cole, the team's primary guide, had been hired for her knowledge of the region's terrain. She was 38, wiry, with a face that was more weathered than her age suggested, and a manner that was more confrontational than her clients usually preferred. She had guided archaeological expeditions, biological surveys, and more than one group of tourists who had overestimated their fitness and underestimated the jungle. She had also, in her 20s, worked as a bush pilot in Alaska, which meant she was one of the few people on the team who had experienced what real isolation felt like, the kind where a broken ankle meant death, not a medevac. Thorne and Jordan had clashed on the first day over the route. Thorne wanted to follow the most direct path to the anomaly, a straight line through unbroken jungle. Jordan wanted to follow the natural game trails, which added 6 kilometers but avoided the worst of the undergrowth. Thorn overruled her. The mercenary captain, a broad, quiet man named Garza who had the deeply lined face of someone who had spent 2 decades in places where people shot at him, sided with Thorn. Jordan said nothing, but she noted, in the small leather journal she kept in her breast pocket, that Thorn had never walked through jungle this dense, and that his straight line would cost them a day and a half. It cost them 2. By the end of the second day, the team was exhausted, dehydrated despite their water supplies, and beginning to fray at the edges. 2 of the graduate students, Courtney Park and Kelsey Ngo, had developed heat rash that was verging on infection. The drone operators had launched one of the thermal units, but the canopy was so dense that the infrared return was useless, a featureless white glow with no structural detail. The satellite phones worked, but barely. The signal came and went in fragments, like a voice heard through a closing door. On the evening of the 3rd day, they found the first marker. It was a stone roughly waist-high, covered in moss and lichen so thick that its shape was indistinct. But when Jordan brushed away the growth with her machete, the carving beneath was unmistakable. A bat, wings outstretched, its mouth open in a way that was not a roar but a yawn, the lazy, obscene gape of something that did not need to threaten because it had no natural predators. Below the bat, a line of KH glyphs that Dr. Alina Vasquez, the team's Mesoamerican linguist, translated with a shaking voice. The throat is open, the dark is hungry, those who enter do not return. Thorn photographed the stone from 6 angles, measured it, noted its position with the GPS unit, and ordered the team to make camp. "It's a boundary marker," he told the group, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had calmed nervous students in 100 lecture halls. "Every major Mayan site has them. They're warnings, not prophecies. Think of them as ancient, no-trespassing signs." Jordan said nothing. She checked her rifle, cleaned the action, and set it beside her sleeping bag. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her hammock and listened to the jungle, which had gone quiet, not silent, because the jungle was never silent, but quieter than it should have been. The insect chorus thinned. The frog calls distant, as if the smaller creatures had decided collectively to be somewhere else. In the morning, they found the cenote. It was not what any of them expected. When Thorn had said vertical descent, the team had pictured a cave, a horizontal passage into a hillside, narrowing and darkening until it opened into whatever lay beneath. What they found instead was a hole in the earth. The cenote was roughly circular, 150 meters across, and it plunged straight down. The walls were limestone, striated and wet, coated in a thick layer of moss and hanging vines that created a curtain of green around the opening. Standing at the edge and looking down was like standing at the lip of a well that had been dug by something vast and careless. The edges were ragged, not cut, and the descent was so steep that the bottom was invisible, swallowed by a darkness that seemed to have weight, as if the light had been not merely absorbed but crushed. The first thing they noticed was the smell. It rose from the opening like breath from an open mouth, thick, sweet, and wrong. It was the smell of old copper, like pennies left in a jar for decades, mixed with something organic and overripe, like fruit that had fallen from a tree and fermented in the heat. It was not the smell of decay, exactly. It was the smell of something that had been alive for so long that it had begun to rot while still breathing. The second thing they noticed was the architecture. The walls of the cenote were not natural. As the team rappelled over the edge, headlamps cutting into the darkness, the beams revealed carvings, not decorations, not murals, but functional structures. Jagged pillars jutted from the limestone at irregular intervals, their surfaces covered in glyphs that spiraled downward in a pattern that Alina identified as a prayer or a recipe or both. There were no stairs, no ramps, no switchbacks or ledges designed for human feet. The pillars were spaced for something that gripped with claws that descended headfirst, that did not need a flat surface to walk on. "The architecture is non-anthropocentric," Kelsey said, her voice thin and echoey in the shaft. She was the team's biologist, a small, intense woman with close-cropped hair and a tendency to state observations as if they were indictments. She had been hired for her expertise in cave ecosystems and her willingness to work in conditions that most biologists refused. She was also, as she would later admit, on the expedition because no university in the country would renew her contract after she had published a paper accusing a senior colleague of falsifying data. She was brilliant, disgraced, and desperate, which made her, in Thorne's estimation, the perfect field scientist. "Non-anthropocentric," Thorne repeated, sounding pleased. "Exactly. This wasn't built for human habitation. It was built for something else, something that lives in the dark." The descent took 4 hours. The team went in 2 groups, 20 each, with Garza's mercenaries handling the rigging. The cenote was deeper than the radar had indicated. The satellite data had shown the void bottoming out at roughly 180 meters. But at that depth, the shaft opened into something that the ground-penetrating radar had not been able to resolve. The walls fell away, the pillars stopped, and the team found themselves suspended in open air, their headlamps swallowed by a space so vast that the beams diffused into nothing before reaching any surface. "Son of a bitch," Garza said. It was the first time anyone on the team had heard him swear. They were in a cavern. It was enormous. The thermal drones, once launched, could not find its walls. The ceiling, when they aimed their lamps upward, was invisible, lost in darkness so total that the beam seemed to end in midair, as if the light had been consumed at a fixed distance, like a candle in a fog. The floor was 50 meters below them, a landscape of broken limestone and shallow, standing water that reflected their lights in dark, trembling pools. And there, across the cavern, visible only when the drone's thermal camera swept the space in a wide arc, structures, walls, corridors, a city carved from the living limestone spreading outward from the base of the cenote shaft like the spokes of a wheel. It was not ruined. It was not decayed. It was intact, preserved by the stable atmosphere of the cavern as if its builders had left the day before. Thorne's voice, when it came over the radio, was trembling, not with fear, but with the barely contained ecstasy of a man who had just been proven right about something the entire world had said was impossible. "Set up base camp on the nearest flat surface," he ordered. "We're going in." The base camp was established on a limestone shelf 50 meters from the base of the descent shaft. The mercenaries set up perimeter lights, high-intensity LED panels that threw a blinding white glare across the immediate area, creating an island of harsh visibility in the ocean of darkness. The scientists set up their equipment, the portable lab, the environmental sensors, the charging stations for the drones. The film crew set up their cameras and began recording. The environmental sensors returned their first readings within minutes, and the data was immediately strange. The air temperature was 34 degrees Celsius, nearly 10 degrees warmer than the surface, despite being nearly 200 meters underground. The humidity was 98%. The oxygen level was slightly below normal, 19.2%, but within tolerable range. The carbon dioxide was elevated, and there were trace gases that the sensors could not identify, compounds that did not match any known atmospheric signature, flagged by the software with a red, unclassified tag that blinked steadily on the readout screen. Kelsey studied the readings for a long time. She noted the temperature anomaly first. "There's a heat source," she said. "Something down here is generating heat. Not geothermal, the gradient is wrong for a volcanic source. It's biological." "Biological?" Thorne raised an eyebrow. "At this depth, in this environment?" "Bacterial mats, possibly, or something larger." Kelsey paused. "The guano deposits alone could account for some of the temperature differential. Decomposition generates heat, but the volume of organic material required to raise the ambient temperature by 10 degrees in a space this large. We're talking about thousands of metric tons. Or one very large organism, Alina said quietly. She was standing at the edge of the shelf, her headlamp aimed out into the darkness. No one responded to this. The first night, though night was a meaningless concept 200 meters underground, passed without incident. The team slept in shifts, the mercenaries maintaining a watch. The perimeter lights hummed steadily. The drones were parked on charging docks, their batteries cycling. The audio recorders captured nothing but the drip of water, the hum of the lights, and the breathing of 40 sleeping people. In the morning, or what they agreed to call morning, Thorne organized the first survey team. 12 people, 4 mercenaries, 6 scientists, and 2 drone operators. The remaining 28 would stay at base camp and maintain communications. Jordan was assigned to the survey team as the group's wilderness guide, a role she found slightly absurd in a subterranean city where no wilderness she had ever encountered existed. Courtney, the graduate student, was assigned to document the carvings. Kelsey was assigned to take biological samples. Alina was assigned to translate the glyphs. The survey team moved out at 800 local time, their headlamps cutting into the darkness ahead of them. The city unfolded before them like a dream of a city, streets that were too wide, buildings that were too short, doorways that were not doorways but gaps in walls that had been worn smooth by something that passed through them repeatedly over centuries. Everything was limestone, carved with a precision that was almost surgical, the edges still sharp despite the millennia. The glyphs covered every surface, spiraling and repeating in patterns that Alina said were not decorative but structural, as if the writing itself was part of the architecture, a text that was also a building, a prayer that was also a cage. Courtney was the first to notice the ceiling. They had been walking for 20 minutes, moving through a wide corridor that the survey team had designated Main Street for ease of reference. The corridor was 10 meters wide and 6 meters high, its walls covered in glyphs, its floor worn smooth by the passage of something heavy. Courtney, who was photographing the ceiling because the glyphs there were larger and more deeply incised than those on the walls, suddenly stopped. "Dr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was very calm, the calm of someone who has seen something that their brain has not yet finished processing. "The ceiling is moving." Thorne looked up. His headlamp hit the ceiling of the corridor, and for a moment the beam seemed to die, swallowed by a surface that was not limestone. It was dark, not the dark of rock but the dark of something organic, something that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It was textured, ridged, like the surface of a lung or the inside of a throat, and it was moving. Slowly, imperceptibly, with the kind of motion that was only visible when you stared at it for long enough to realize that the pattern of ridges was shifting, like a field of grain in a slow wind. "That's not rock," Kelsey said. She had aimed her flashlight upward and was squinting, her face pale in the reflected light. "That's biological. It's a membrane or a colony. I need a sample." "Don't touch it," Jordan said. Her voice was flat, and it carried an authority that had nothing to do with academic credentials. It was the voice of someone who had been in enough dangerous places to know that the things you couldn't identify were the things that killed you. Thorne hesitated. The scientist in him wanted a sample. The expedition leader in him wanted to push forward to find the inner sanctum, to document the discovery that would redefine his field. But something older than either of those impulses, the animal part of his brain, the part that had been mapping threats since before his ancestors had stood upright, made him take a step back. "Mark this location," he said. "We'll come back with sampling equipment and a full drone sweep. Move on." They moved on, but Jordan, walking at the rear of the column, looked up one more time at the ceiling and saw something that made her blood go cold. The membrane was not just moving, it was breathing, and in the folds and ridges of its surface, barely visible in the sweep of her headlamp, there were shapes, elongated, folded, tucked into the creases of the organic ceiling like newborns in a hammock. They were not moving. They were not awake. But they were there, dozens of them, suspended above the team like ornaments on a grotesque tree, their outlines barely distinguishable from the membrane that held them. Jordan opened her mouth to say something. Then she closed it. She did not know what she had seen. She did not know if saying it out loud would make it more real or less. She kept walking, and she did not look up again. The survey team returned to base camp 4 hours later. They had mapped 600 meters of the city's main corridor and identified 3 branching passages, each of which descended further into the limestone. Alina had transcribed over 200 glyphs and was sitting at the field table, her hands trembling slightly as she cross-referenced the inscriptions with the K'ich dictionary on her tablet. The text, she told Thorne, was not a prayer. It was a manual, a set of instructions for maintaining the throat, for keeping it open, for feeding what lived inside it, for ensuring that the boundary between the world above and the world below remained thin. The glyphs described rituals of blood, of offering, of appeasement. They described the creature, Camazotz, not as a god but as a guardian, a thing that had been placed in the throat of the world by something older than the Maya, older than the Olmec, older than any civilization that had left records in stone. The creature did not serve the Maya. The Maya served the creature, and the civilization that had built this city had done so not to worship it but to contain it. "The city isn't a temple," Alina said, looking up from her tablet with an expression that was close to nausea. "It's a cage." The glyphs describe the architecture as a restraint, a structure designed to keep the creature in the dark, to prevent it from reaching the surface. The Maya didn't come here to pray. They came here to make sure it stayed asleep. Thorne absorbed this with the clinical detachment that had made him famous in academic circles and infamous in personal ones. "A containment structure," he said. "Interesting. That implies the builders understood the creature's behavioral parameters, its habitat preferences, its hunting patterns. That's invaluable data." Alina stared at him. "Dr. Thorne, the text says the creature killed the civilization that built the cage. It says the containment failed because the offering stopped. The people who built this city were the last people to see the creature alive, and the text describes their deaths in detail. It says the creature unmade them from the throat upward. It says." "We'll review the translations tonight," Thorne said. "Right now, I need the drone team to sweep the corridor we surveyed. I want a full thermal map of that ceiling membrane." The drone operators launched 2 thermal units at 14:30. The drones were small, quadcopter style, equipped with FLIR cameras and real-time video feeds that displayed on a monitor at base camp. They flew them up the main corridor, the thermal cameras painting the space in false color, blue for cold, red for hot, white for ambient. The walls of the corridor were blue, the standing water was green, the air was a uniform yellow. The ceiling was a deep, pulsing red. Not a uniform red like a warm surface. A pulsing red, rhythmic and organic, with darker veins running through it like a circulatory system. The drone cameras showed it in terrible detail. The membrane was not a flat surface but a folded living thing, its ridges expanding and contracting with the slow, patient rhythm of something asleep. And in the folds, visible in the thermal overlay as bright orange points, were the shapes that Jordan had seen. Body-sized, body temperature, dozens of them. "Those aren't geological formations," Kelsey said. She was standing behind the drone operator, her arms crossed, her face set in an expression of professional fury, the fury of a scientist who was looking at data that should not exist. "Those are biological. They're warm-blooded. They're roosting." "Bats," Thorne said. "Megachiropterans, most likely. The largest known bat species has a wingspan of about 1.7 meters. If this ecosystem has been isolated for centuries, gigantism is a predictable evolutionary response. The thermal signature is consistent with a colony of—" "Dr. Thorne," Kelsey interrupted. It was the first time anyone had heard her raise her voice. "I have studied bats for 15 years. Those are not bats. Bats don't have a body temperature of 41 degrees. Bats don't roost in a membrane that's connected to a circulatory system. Bats don't generate a metabolic signature that size. She pointed at the screen, where one of the orange points had shifted, a slow, unfolding movement like a hand unclenching. That thing is the size of a person. The room went quiet. The drone feed continued, the camera panning slowly across the ceiling, the thermal overlay revealing more and more of the shapes, some folded tight, some partially extended, some hanging by what appeared to be a single point of attachment like fruit on a branch. And then, without warning, one of the shapes moved. Not slowly, not in the lazy, stretching way of a waking animal. It moved with a speed that the camera could not resolve. One frame it was a folded orange mass on the ceiling, the next frame the space was empty, and in the frame after that, the drone's camera was filled with a blur of black that obliterated the image. The screen went dark. The drone's telemetry flatlined. The second drone, flying 30 meters behind the first, captured a single frame before it, too, went dark. A shape, man-sized, with a wingspan that filled the corridor, its body a featureless black silhouette against the thermal background of the ceiling membrane. Its wings were not feathered or furred. They were leather smooth, taut, ridged with veins that pulsed with the same rhythm as the membrane. And its hands, because they were hands, not claws, not paws, but elongated, jointed fingers with hooked tips, were reaching toward the camera. The drone operators looked at Thorn. The mercenaries looked at Garza. Jordan looked at the ceiling of the cavern, 200 meters above, and thought about what she had seen in the corridor ceiling and what she had not said. "We retrieved the drones," Thorn said. His voice was steady, but the color had drained from his face. "And we post a guard detail at the corridor entrance. No one goes back in there without full escort." "Full escort and what else?" Garza asked. He had been standing at the back of the room, arms crossed, watching the screen with the expression of a man who had seen enough combat to recognize a threat assessment in the making. "And the rifles," Thorn said, "loaded." The disappearances began that night. The first was a mercenary named Tors. He was 26, quiet, competent, the kind of soldier who followed orders without question and without conversation. He was assigned to the night watch, the 200 to 600 shift, paired with another mercenary named Delgado. They were stationed at the edge of the base camp perimeter, where the shelf of limestone met the open darkness of the cavern. The perimeter lights were set to maximum, their glare throwing sharp-edged shadows across the broken floor of the cave. At 3:47, Delgado turned to speak to Tors and found that Tors was no longer standing next to him. There was no sound, no warning, no movement in the darkness beyond the lights. Tors was simply gone. His rifle was leaning against the rock where he had propped it. His headlamp was on the ground, still lit, its beam pointing uselessly at the ceiling. His radio was in its holster. Everything was where it should be, except for the man. Delgado called it in immediately. Garza mobilized a search team, 6 mercenaries, full tactical gear, night vision optics. They swept the perimeter in widening arcs, their lights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. They found nothing. No tracks, no blood, no sign of a struggle. The limestone floor was bare and featureless, too hard to hold footprints, too clean to suggest that a 200-pound man had been dragged across it. Then one of the searchers aimed his light upward. Tors was on the ceiling. He was 50 feet above the cavern floor, pinned to the underside of a limestone overhang by something that the light could not fully illuminate, a dark, folded mass that held him the way a hand holds a doll. His body was limp, his arms hanging, his head tilted at an angle that no living spine could produce. And from his throat, from the place where his throat had been, a thin, steady stream of liquid was falling, barely visible in the searchlight's beam, dark and viscous, hitting the cave floor with a sound so faint that it was less a noise than a rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. The stream was not blood. It was too dark, too thick, too slow. It was as if every fluid in Tor's body had been consolidated, condensed, and was being drained through a single aperture in his neck. His skin, visible in the light, was white, not pale, white, the color of paper, the color of a body that had been emptied. Delgado screamed. The sound echoed through the cavern, bouncing off walls that were too far away to see, multiplying and distorting until it sounded like a chorus of screams coming from every direction. Garza grabbed Delgado by the shoulder and pulled him back toward the base camp, shouting orders into his radio. All personnel, return to base camp immediately. All personnel, return to base camp immediately. We have a man down. Repeat, we have a man down. The team assembled at base camp in minutes. 39 people packed into the circle of light cast by the perimeter panels, their faces pale, their breathing rapid. Garza did not sugarcoat it. Tor's is dead, he said. Something took him, something fast enough to move a grown man 50 feet straight up without making a sound. I need everyone inside the light perimeter. No one goes to the edge. No one goes anywhere alone. Thorn pushed through the crowd. What exactly did you see? He asked the searcher who had found the body. The searcher, a mercenary named Briggs, described it in flat, disconnected sentences that were more disturbing for their lack of emotion than they would have been with it. He was stuck to the ceiling, like a piece of meat on a hook. There was something wrapped around him, dark, big, couldn't see it properly because the light didn't reflect off it. It just absorbed the light, like it was made of shadow, and it was feeding. There was this sound, this wet, clicking sound, and the body was shrinking, getting smaller, like it was being hollowed out. Kelsey stepped forward. Did you see its face? Briggs looked at her. His eyes were wide and there was a tremor in his jaw that he was trying very hard to control. It didn't have a face, it had a hole, like a mouth, but not a mouth, more like a funnel, and inside the funnel there were these things moving, like fingers, like it was reaching down its own throat to pull him apart from the inside. The camp went silent. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the perimeter lights, something clicked, a short, precise sound like a bone being snapped, and then was silent again. Dawn, or what passed for dawn in the subterranean dark, brought no relief. The team gathered in the base camp's tight circle, eating ration packs without tasting them, speaking in low voices as if the darkness might be listening. Thorn had not slept. He sat at the field table, his tablet open, reviewing the drone footage frame by frame, zooming in on the blurred shape that had destroyed the second drone. The image was useless, a smear of black against the thermal background, no detail, no morphology, just the suggestion of wings and hands and something that moved too fast for technology to capture. "We need to go back in there," Thorn said. No one responded. He looked up from the tablet and surveyed the faces around him. The graduate students were frightened, the kind of frightened that made them clutch their notebooks tighter, as if documentation was a talisman. The mercenaries were tense, the kind of tense that made them check their weapons repeatedly, racking slides and clearing chambers in a compulsive rhythm. Alina was sitting apart from the group, her tablet in her lap, scrolling through the glyph translations with an expression of dawning horror. And Jordan was standing at the edge of the light perimeter, staring into the dark, her rifle held across her chest. "Dr. Thorn," Alina said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've translated the containment section of the glyphs. The text describes the creature's hunting method. It says Camazotz does not see with eyes. It sees with sound. It emits a high-frequency click in the range of 40 to 200 kilohertz, well above human hearing, and the returning echoes build a three-dimensional map of its environment. It can detect a heartbeat at a distance of 100 meters. It can distinguish between individuals by the resonance of their breathing. And it is most active," she paused, her face going even paler, "in enclosed spaces with high humidity and ambient warmth." "So its echolocation," Kelsey said, "like a bat, which means it already knows exactly where we are," Jordan said from the edge of the camp. She had not turned around. "Every one of us, our positions, our heart rates, How many of us are scared and how many are calm? It's been listening to us since we walked in here. We didn't discover this place. We walked into its dining room. Thorn stood up. We have weapons, we have technology, we have 39 people. One creature, however large, does not change the fundamental equation. We document it, Dr. Thorn, Garza interrupted. It was the first time the mercenary captain had spoken over him. With respect, sir, you are thinking of this as a specimen. I am thinking of it as a threat. And as a threat, I can tell you that whatever killed Tors did not kill him the way a predator kills prey. It killed him the way a surgeon operates. It was precise, it was deliberate, and it was patient. It waited for the exact moment when he was isolated. It took him in total silence, and it carried him 50 feet straight up. That is not hunting behavior, sir. That is intelligence. The room was silent. Thorn opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in the expedition, and perhaps for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. The second disappearance happened at 9:30. This time there was no silence. This time everyone heard it. The victim was a graduate student named David Okonkwo. He was 24, specializing in cave geology, and he had gone to the edge of the base camp to collect a water sample from one of the standing pools. He was accompanied by a mercenary named Harris, as per Garza's new buddy protocol. They were 30 meters from the perimeter lights within the zone of visibility when the sound came. It was a shriek, but not the shriek of an animal. It was a sound that existed on the edge of human perception, a frequency so high it was felt more than heard, a vibration that entered through the bones of the skull and bypassed the eardrums entirely. It lasted less than a second. But in that second, every person in the base camp felt it, a spike of pressure behind the eyes, a sudden nausea, a momentary disorientation that made several people stagger and one person vomit. When their vision cleared, Harris was on his knees, his hands over his ears, blood streaming from his ear canals. And David was gone, not vanished, not lifted silently into the dark. He was being dragged, rapidly, violently, across the limestone floor toward the entrance of the main corridor. The thing that had him was visible only as a shape, a dark, low silhouette that moved with a fluid, boneless speed that was wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate. It was not running. It was flowing, its body in contact with the ground but not pressing into it, as if it weighed nothing, as if gravity was a suggestion it had chosen to ignore. David was screaming. His voice echoed through the cavern, bouncing off the invisible walls, and the sound was distorted by the acoustics into something that barely sounded human, a sustained, terrified wail that Doppler shifted as he was pulled further away, the pitch rising and falling as he bounced off the uneven floor. Harris recovered enough to raise his rifle and fire. 3 shots rapid, the muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness. The first 2 missed. The creature was moving too fast, its trajectory unpredictable, its body too low to the ground to present a clear target. The third shot hit something. There was a wet, heavy sound, like a round hitting a sandbag, and the creature's motion stuttered for a fraction of a second. Then it accelerated, and David's scream was cut short, not silenced but truncated, as if a door had been closed on the sound, as if the corridor had swallowed both the scream and the man who was making it. The echoes of David's final scream lingered in the cavern for nearly 10 seconds, growing fainter and more distorted, until they were indistinguishable from the ambient drip of water. Then there was silence. Garza was on the radio immediately, ordering the remaining mercenaries to form a defensive perimeter. Thorn was shouting orders to the drone operators, telling them to launch everything they had. The film crew was recording, their cameras shaking in hands that could not be steadied. The drones launched. 4 thermal units flying in formation, their cameras sweeping the cavern in overlapping arcs. The thermal overlay showed the base camp as a bright cluster of warm bodies, the cavern floor as a cold blue expanse, and the main corridor as a dark tunnel with no heat signature. Then one of the drone operators pointed at the screen. "There," he said, "corridor entrance, thermal return." The screen showed a shape. It was in the entrance of the main corridor, crouched low, partially obscured by the stone. The thermal camera rendered it in false color, a deep red core surrounded by orange and yellow, its outline vaguely humanoid but wrong, the proportions off, the limbs too long, the body too narrow. It was facing the base camp. It was not moving. It was watching. "Can we get a visual?" Thorne asked. The operator switched one drone to optical mode, aiming its camera at the same point. The image that appeared was almost worse than the thermal. In the drone's white light, the shape was visible but indistinct, a dark mass against the darker stone, with no features, no eyes, no face. Just a body, folded tight, with wings that were tucked against its sides like a closed umbrella, and hands, long, articulate, dark-skinned hands, that rested on the stone floor with the casual ease of a pianist resting his fingers on a keyboard. "Size estimate?" Kelsey asked. Her voice was clinical, detached, the voice of a scientist trying to hold onto the framework of her training while everything she knew was being dismantled. "Body length approximately 1.8 meters, the operator said. "Wingspan. I can't get an accurate measurement with the wings folded, but based on the wing root, at least 6 meters, maybe more." "Human-sized body with a 6-meter wingspan," Kelsey said. "That's not aerodynamically viable for powered flight. The muscle mass required." "It's not flying," Jordan said, still standing at the edge of the light. "It's gliding and climbing. It doesn't need to sustain flight. It needs to drop, glide, and grab. That's how it took Tors. That's how it took David. It comes from above, it grabs, and it carries you into the dark before anyone can react." The drone feed showed the creature shift. It was a small movement, just a slight rotation of the head, if it could be called a head, but it was directed at the drone. The operator saw it at the same time everyone else did. The creature had turned toward the camera. It knew the drone was there. It knew it was being watched. And then in the next frame, the drone was gone. The feed went static. The operator switched to the second drone's feed, same location, same angle, and for one single frame, the creature was visible in full. Its wings were open. They were vast, far larger than 6 meters, closer to 9, membranes stretched between elongated finger bones that ended in hooked, obsidian-dark claws. Its body was lean, almost emaciated, the ribs visible through the dark, leathery skin. Its head was not a head in any conventional sense. It was a structure, a ridge of bone and cartilage that rose from the shoulders and curved forward into a crest, like the prow of a ship. Below the crest, where a face should have been, there was only a mouth, a wide, lipless aperture lined with teeth that were not teeth but were instead thin, pointed spines of bone, arranged in concentric rings that spiraled inward toward a throat that was black and deep and seemed to go nowhere. The image burned itself into the memory of every person who saw it. And then the second drone was gone, and the third, and the fourth, each one destroyed in rapid succession, the feeds collapsing into static one after another like lights being switched off in a hallway. The creature did not approach the base camp that night. It did not need to. It had made its point. It had shown them that their technology was useless, that their lights were not a barrier but a beacon, and that in its dark, they were not explorers. They were offerings. The next 48 hours were a siege. The team huddled in the base camp, the perimeter lights blazing, the mercenaries taking shifts on watch. They did not sleep. They could not sleep. Every sound, the drip of water, the hum of the generators, the click of a boot on limestone, was analyzed, catalogued, and feared. The audio recorders captured everything: whispered conversations, stifled sobs, the mechanical rhythm of weapons being checked and rechecked. 2 more people died. The first was a logistics coordinator named Priya Sharma. She had gone to the latrine, a chemical toilet set up behind a rock formation 20 meters from the nearest light panel, as close to private as the base camp could offer. She was gone for 4 minutes. When she did not return, the two mercenaries assigned to escort her went to check. They found the chemical toilet overturned, its contents spilled across the limestone, and on the wall behind it, written in a substance that was too dark and too thick to be anything but blood, were glyphs. The same glyphs that covered the walls of the city. Elena, when brought to the scene, translated them with a voice that cracked on every syllable. The throat is open. The offering is accepted. Priya was never found. Not on the ceiling, not in the corridor, not anywhere. She had been taken in total silence, within 20 meters of 37 people, in a pool of light that reached every corner of the immediate area. There was no gap in the light, no shadow large enough to conceal a creature the size of a man. Whatever had taken her had come from above, straight down, through the light, into the narrow space behind the rock, and back up, all in the time it took two mercenaries to turn their heads. The second death was worse. It happened at the edge of the perimeter, during the change of the watch. A graduate student named Martin Liu, a quiet, diligent young man who had been documenting the limestone formations, was walking back to the central area when something came out of the darkness. Not from the ceiling this time, from the floor. From a crack in the limestone that was no wider than a man's hand, something reached up, long, dark, jointed fingers that closed around Martin's ankle with a grip that was audible, a wet, cracking sound of bone meeting bone. Martin screamed and fell. His fingers clawed at the limestone, leaving bloody scratches in the rock. The mercenaries responded instantly, rifles up, flashlights aimed. They saw the fingers, black, glistening, extending from the crack like the legs of a spider, and they fired. The shots hit the limestone around the crack, sending chips of stone flying. One shot hit the fingers. There was a sound, a wet, tearing sound, and 3 of the fingers were severed, falling to the cave floor, where they twitched once, twice, and then lay still. But the grip did not release. Whatever was attached to those fingers, the hand, the arm, the body, pulled. Martin was dragged toward the crack, his body scraping across the limestone, his screams rising in pitch as the crack widened, not splitting, but opening, as if the stone itself was a mouth that was choosing to consume him. His head went first. The crack was too narrow for a human skull, but it took it anyway, the stone flexing around his head with a sound that was not grinding but wet, a sound like a throat swallowing something too large. His shoulders followed, his chest, his hips, his legs kicking, his boots scraping against the stone until the last of him was pulled through and the crack closed, sealing shut as if it had never been there, leaving nothing behind but the bloody scratches on the floor and the 3 severed fingers, which had already begun to dissolve. The mercenaries stood in silence, their weapons still raised, their flashlights aimed at a crack that was no longer visible. The limestone floor was smooth and unbroken, as if it had been poured yesterday. Martin's audio recorder, which had been clipped to his vest, was found 3 hours later on the floor of the main corridor, 100 meters from the base camp. It had been placed there deliberately, set down, not dropped, positioned upright on a flat surface with the microphone facing the direction from which the team would approach. The recording on it was 18 minutes long. The first 12 minutes were Martin's screams, growing fainter and more distorted, layered over a sound that was like breathing but was not breathing, a deep, rhythmic exhalation that seemed to come from everywhere, as if the cave itself was alive and was processing Martin the way a stomach processes food. The final 6 minutes were silence, followed by a single sound, a click, a biological click precisely modulated that when analyzed later turned out to be an exact acoustic replica of Martin's voice saying, "Help me." The creature had learned to speak with his voice. It had taken him apart, studied the resonance of his vocal cords, and reproduced the sound of a human plea for help using nothing but its own throat. Thorne listened to the recording once. Then he walked to the edge of the base camp, sat down on a rock and put his head in his hands. He stayed there for a long time. When he stood up, his face was the face of a man who had been hollowed out, not by the creature but by the weight of his own certainty collapsing under the pressure of something that certainty could not survive. "We can't stay here," Jordan said. She had been watching him. "The perimeter lights won't last. The generators have fuel for another 60 hours. After that, we're in the dark, and in the dark it owns us." Thorn looked at her. "What do you suggest?" "We go deeper," she said. "The glyph said the city is a cage, a structure designed to contain the creature. The inner sanctum, the altar room, if there's a way out, it's there. And if there isn't, it's still better than waiting here for the generators to die." "She's right," Kelsey said. "The thermal data shows the sealing membrane is most concentrated in the area around the main corridor. The deeper passages, the ones that descend below the city, show less thermal activity. If the creature is tethered to the membrane, the lower levels might be safer." "And if they're not?" Garza asked. "Then we die in a different part of the cave," Jordan said. "But at least we're moving. At least we're not sitting here waiting for it to pick us off one by one." The vote was not unanimous. Several of the graduate students wanted to stay, to wait for a rescue that they believed would come when the satellite phone signal was reestablished. The film crew wanted to stay because they had footage that was worth more than their lives, at least in the estimation of their contracts. 2 of the mercenaries wanted to stay because the base camp was a defensible position and the corridor was not. But the majority agreed with Jordan. And when Thorn, in a voice that was barely recognizable as the voice of the man who had given the briefing in Flores, said, "We move at 600, the decision was made. That night, the last night in the base camp, 3 more people vanished. They were taken from the center of the group, not the periphery. They were taken while surrounded by other people, within arm's reach of the nearest neighbor in the full glare of the perimeter lights. There was no sound. There was no movement visible in the light or the dark. They were simply there, and then they were not, and the only evidence that they had ever existed was the warm impression their bodies left on the limestone, fading in seconds, as if the cave was absorbing their heat along with their lives. 31 people remained. They left the base camp at 600, carrying everything they could, leaving behind the generators and the perimeter lights and the field laboratory and the film equipment and the charging stations and the hopes and the certainty and the arrogance that had brought them here. They descended into the city. The city below the city was older. That was the first thing they noticed. The limestone in the lower levels was not the pale, sharp-edged stone of the upper corridors. It was dark, almost black, worn smooth by centuries of contact with something that had rubbed against it, pressed against it, lived against it. The glyphs here were different too. Alina, walking at the center of the group, her tablet clutched to her chest, translated them in fragments as she passed. Warnings, instructions, litanies of the dead. The text described the inner sanctum as the throat of the throat, the deepest point of the structure, the place where the cage was anchored, where the creature slept, where the offerings were made. "The glyphs say the altar is at the bottom," Alina reported, her voice thin. "They say the blood of the offerings fed the cage. The cage is the membrane. The membrane is alive. It's part of the creature, or the creature is part of it. They're a single organism. The ceiling of the upper cavern, the membrane, the creature, they're all one thing." "One thing," Kelsey repeated. She was walking beside Alina, her flashlight aimed at the floor, her face set in the hard expression of a scientist trying to process data that did not fit any model she had been trained in. "A single organism with a body mass of what? The membrane covers the entire ceiling of the main cavern. That's thousands of square meters. And the creatures, the shapes we saw roosting in the folds, are those part of it too? Are they? Offspring, organs?" "The glyphs don't distinguish," Alina said. "They use a single word for everything, the dark that eats. It's not a species. It's not an individual. It's a system. A biological system that has been growing in this cave for millennia, feeding on whatever enters, expanding its territory upward through the limestone." "That's why there are no stairs," Jordan said from the front of the column. She had been thinking about this since the first descent. The architecture isn't built for the creature. It's built by the creature. The pillars, the corridors, the shapes of the rooms, they're not architecture. They're digestion. The organism is metabolizing the limestone, dissolving it, reshaping it. The city isn't a city, it's a cast, a fossil trace. The limestone is being consumed from the inside out, and what we're walking through is the space that's left behind. The group processed this in silence. The idea that they were not walking through a building, but through the digestive tract of a living organism, a single, ancient, impossibly vast organism that had been eating the earth beneath the Petén Basin for centuries, was too large to hold in the conscious mind. It sat in their stomachs like a stone, and they walked, and they did not speak. The lower levels were warmer. The temperature climbed steadily as they descended from 34 degrees to 36 to 38 to 40. The air grew thicker, the copperandrot smell intensifying until it was a physical presence, a film on the skin, a taste on the back of the tongue. The walls were wet, not with condensation but with something that was slick and organic, a secretion that glistened in the flashlight beams and made the stone treacherous underfoot. The standing water in the passages was not clear. It was dark, viscous, faintly iridescent, like oil on water. Kelsey knelt beside one of the pools and dipped a test strip. The results were immediate and alarming. The water was acidic, pH 3.2, and contained dissolved organic compounds that the strip could not identify. Digestive enzymes, she said. This isn't water, it's saliva or gastric fluid. The organism is dissolving the limestone and metabolizing it, and these pools are the runoff. We're walking through its stomach, Courtney said. She was behind Kelsey, her face white, her hands shaking. She was 23, the youngest member of the team, and she had joined the expedition because she needed the field credits for her dissertation. She had expected bugs and humidity and bad food. She had not expected to be crawling through the digestive system of a monster. "Keep moving," Garza said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were everywhere. The ceiling, the walls, the floor, the pools, every shadow, every crack. He had reduced the mercenary detail to a tight formation. 4 men at the front, 4 at the rear, the remaining 3 flanking the scientists. The rifles were up. The safeties were off. The flashlights were aimed outward. They descended for 2 hours. The passages narrowed, widened, branched, and rejoined. A labyrinth of organic architecture that defied their attempts to map it. Twice, they had to backtrack when a passage dead-ended in a wall of membrane, the dark, breathing membrane that they had first seen on the ceiling of the upper cavern, now appearing at floor level, blocking their path like a curtain of flesh. They did not touch it. They did not go near it. They turned around and found another way. And then, without warning, the passage opened. The inner sanctum was a dome. It was roughly 30 meters across and 15 meters high, carved, or dissolved, from the limestone in a shape that was too regular to be natural and too organic to be designed. The walls were covered in glyphs, but these glyphs were different. They were not incised into the stone but raised from it, as if the stone itself had grown them, as if the writing was not something that had been done to the rock but something the rock had produced. They spiraled upward from the floor to the apex of the dome in a single, unbroken line, and Alina, when she saw them, made a sound that was not a word. "The entire history," she whispered. "The entire history of the civilization that built this place. Every offering, every death, every year of the containment. It's all here, written in the stone in the body of the organism. The cave isn't just digesting the limestone, it's recording what it eats." In the center of the dome was the altar. It was not a stone. It was a mass, roughly cylindrical, waist-high, dark red, organic. It was made of compressed, desiccated material that Kelsey identified, with a clinical detachment that was beginning to sound like madness, as bat guano. Thousands of years of guano deposits, compressed by their own weight into a solid column, and embedded in the guano, visible in the flashlight beams, catching the light, reflecting it in the dull, opaque gleam of old bone, were the remains of every expedition that had ever come here. Fragments of skull, curved shards of rib, finger bones, vertebrae, the rounded knobs of joints, Spanish conquistador buckles, Mayan jade beads, the rusted remnants of a 20th-century machete, the decomposed leather of a boot, and most recently a digital watch, its face cracked, its battery dead, its band still buckled, sitting on the surface of the guano column as if its owner had simply set it down and walked away. "This is a graveyard," Jordan said. She was standing at the edge of the altar, her rifle aimed at the floor, her face expressionless. "Every person who has ever come here is in this column. The conquistadors, the Maya, the people before the Maya. The creature doesn't just kill them, it brings them here. It adds them to the altar. It's building something." "An offering," Alina said. She was reading the glyphs on the wall, her fingers tracing the raised symbols, her voice distant, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. "The text says the altar is the heart of the cage. Every body that is added to it strengthens the membrane, strengthens the containment. The creature doesn't want to escape. It wants to be contained. The offerings aren't for the creature. They're for the cage. The cage needs organic material to grow, to maintain itself, to keep the creature in the dark. The creature is feeding the cage. It's feeding the cage with us." "That doesn't make sense," Thorne said. He had been standing at the back of the group, silent, his face aged 10 years in the last 3 days. "If the creature wants to be contained, why is it killing us? Why not just let us leave?" "Because the cage is hungry," Alina said. "And the cage and the creature are the same thing. The creature doesn't want to be contained. The creature doesn't want anything. It's a system, Dr. Thorne, a biological system that has been running for millennia. The creature hunts. The cage consumes. The offerings sustain the cycle. It's not malevolent, it's not evil, it's just hungry, and we walked into its mouth." The silence that followed was the deepest they had experienced. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a room that was listening. The walls of the dome seemed to pulse, very faintly, in a rhythm that was not their heartbeat but was synced to it, as if the organism was counting their pulses, measuring their fear, calculating how long they could sustain their terror before they broke. Garza broke the silence. "How do we get out?" Alina pointed to a passage on the far side of the dome. The glyphs describe a drainage tunnel, a natural fissure in the limestone that connects the inner sanctum to the surface. It was used by the Maya as an escape route during the containment rituals. The priests who made the offerings had to have a way out. It's narrow, it's long, but it leads to the surface. "How narrow?" Jordan asked. "Narrow enough that the creature can't follow. The text says the dark that eats cannot enter the drainage tunnel. It's too large. The tunnel was designed as a bottleneck, a restriction that the organism cannot penetrate." "And the membrane?" Kelsey asked. "The sealing membrane, is that part of the creature or is it the cage?" "Both. The membrane is the organism's primary sensory organ. It detects heat, sound, vibration. It maps everything in the cavern and feeds the information to the creature. The creature is the active part, the hunting part. The membrane is passive, it waits. The creature moves." "So if we go through the drainage tunnel," Jordan said, "we bypass the creature entirely. We don't have to fight it, we just have to get to the tunnel." "And the tunnel is on the other side of this dome," Garza said, "which means we have to cross this room, in the dark, in the creature's home, in the one place where it's most powerful." 30 meters, Jordan said. 30 meters of open ground in the dark, with something that can see our heartbeat." The group looked at each other. 31 people, standing in a dome of living stone, surrounded by the compressed remains of every human being who had ever made this journey, their flashlights creating islands of visibility in a darkness that was not empty but full of something that was listening, something that was waiting, something that had been patient for centuries and could be patient for centuries more. "We go now," Jordan said. "Right now, before it comes back, before the membrane has time to map us completely. We coat ourselves in the cave deposits, the guano, the fluid from the pools. It's acidic, it's disgusting, but it's organic. It might mask our thermal signature, and we go slow. We go silent. We don't speak, we don't whisper. We breathe through our noses and we move on our hands and knees, and we do not stop until we reach the tunnel. You want us to crawl through bat guano and acid, Garza said. I want us to live, Jordan said. And that means becoming invisible to something that sees heat and hears heartbeats. So yes, we crawl through bat guano and acid, or we stay here and become part of the altar. They moved. There was no more debate, no more voting, no more academic posturing. The fear had burned through the last of their certainties, and what remained was animal, simple, desperate, focused on a single imperative: survive. Jordan took the lead. She had stripped to her undershirt and smeared the dark, viscous fluid from the cave pools across every exposed surface of her skin: face, arms, neck, hands. The fluid stung. It was acidic enough to cause a low, persistent burn on the skin, and the smell, the copperandrot smell that had been building since they entered the cavern, was now so concentrated that it was a physical presence, a wall of stench that made her eyes water and her throat close. But she had tested it, pressing her hand against the thermal camera's sensor after coating it, and the results were undeniable. The fluid masked her heat signature almost completely. On the thermal display, her hand was a cold, dark shape, indistinguishable from the cave floor. One by one, the others followed. 31 people, crawling on their hands and knees across the floor of the inner sanctum, their bodies coated in acidic guano and cave fluid, their flashlights extinguished, moving in total darkness toward a passage that might or might not exist, guided by nothing but the memory of Alina's pointing finger and the faint, rhythmic pulse of the dome's walls. The darkness was not empty. That was the first horror. As they crawled, they could feel the floor beneath them changing, the smooth limestone giving way to the textured, ridged surface of the membrane, which was not confined to the ceiling. It was everywhere. The floor, the walls, the ceiling of the dome were all covered in it, a continuous living surface that pulsed beneath their hands with the slow, patient rhythm of something asleep. And it was warm. Warm the way a body is warm, not heated but alive, the heat of metabolism, of cells dividing, of something that was growing, slowly, imperceptibly in the dark. The second horror was the sound. They had silenced their flashlights, but they could not silence their bodies. 31 people breathing, hearts beating, joints popping, stomachs gurgling. The acoustic environment of the dome amplified every sound, bouncing it off the curved walls, layering it, creating a sonic landscape that was almost as loud as the jungle they had left behind. And beneath their own sounds, barely audible, was another sound, a click, a single biological click repeated at irregular intervals coming from no identifiable direction. The creature was mapping them. It was awake. It was listening. Jordan moved forward, her hands finding the floor by touch, her breath held until her lungs burned, then released in slow, controlled exhalations through her nose. She could feel the membrane beneath her fingers, its surface slick and warm and slightly yielding, like skin. She could feel it pulse. And she could feel, with a certainty that was not rational but was absolute, that it knew she was there. That it could feel her weight, her warmth, her heartbeat, the blood moving through her veins. It could not see her, not with eyes, not with the thermal senses that the guano fluid was designed to mask. But it could feel her, the way a spider feels the vibration of a fly in its web. Behind her, the column moved in a ragged, stumbling line. Kelsey was directly behind Jordan, her movements precise and controlled, her breathing regulated by the same techniques she used in the field when collecting samples from dangerous environments. Behind Kelsey was Courtney, and behind Courtney was the rest of the group: scientists, mercenaries, film crew, the cook, the logistics coordinator's replacement. 31 people trying to be silent, trying to be invisible, trying to be less than what they were. The first attack came without warning. It was not a sound that preceded it. It was a change in the air, a sudden, violent displacement, as if something vast had moved through the space above them with a speed that displaced the atmosphere itself. The wind from its passage hit them like a physical blow, flattening them against the membrane-covered floor, and the sound that followed was not a shriek but a tearing, a wet, ripping sound like cloth being pulled apart, like flesh being opened, and it was directly above them, so close that they could feel the displacement of air on the backs of their necks. A scream, short, sharp, cut off instantly, not silenced but severed, as if the throat that produced it had been removed in the same instant that the scream began. Then a second sound, a wet, heavy impact, a body hitting a surface hard enough to break bone. Then a third sound, the clicking. Rapid, excited, a cascade of biological percussion that filled the dome like rain on a tin roof. Jordan did not stop. She did not look up. She did not turn around. She crawled faster, her hands and knees scraping against the membrane, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps that she could not fully control. Behind her, the column fragmented. She heard people scrambling, heard the clatter of equipment, heard someone. She thought it was one of the film crew shouting, "The light, get the light, get the..." And then that voice too was cut off, not with a scream but with a sound that was worse. A gurgle, a wet, bubbling exhalation that trailed into silence. A flashlight clicked on. In the sudden, blinding glare, the dome was revealed in terrible clarity, the walls, the altar, the membrane-covered floor, and the creature. It was not on the ceiling. It was on the floor. It was in the middle of the group. It was standing, not perched, not hanging, but standing on the membrane-covered floor of the dome, its body upright, its wings folded against its sides, its head, the crested, faceless head with its spiraling rows of teeth, turned toward the light. The light was its enemy. The creature flinched from it, its body coiling, its wings snapping open with a sound like a sail catching wind. In the flashlight's beam, the creature was fully visible for the first time, and the sight of it was enough to drive the last remnants of rational thought from the mind of every person who saw it. It was not a bat. It was not a lizard. It was not any animal that had ever been classified or described or imagined. It was something that had evolved in total darkness for millennia, and its body was a testament to that evolution. Eyeless, earless, its head a sensory array of ridges and depressions that channeled sound, its body lean and armored with a carapace of dark. Chitinous plates, its wings vast and veined and ending in hooked claws that were stained dark with something that was not dirt. Its hands, its terrible, articulate, human-like hands, hanging at its sides with the casual patience of something that knew it had already won. It lunged, the flashlight went out, the screaming began. The next 5 minutes were a massacre. The creature moved through the group with a speed that defied perception. Jordan, crawling on the floor, her face pressed against the membrane, could hear it but could not track it. It was everywhere and nowhere, a displacement of air, a wet sound, a scream, a silence, repeated in a rapid, brutal cycle. The mercenaries fired. The muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness, each burst of light revealing a snapshot of horror. A body being lifted, a body being pinned to the wall by a wing spike through the chest, a head being separated from a neck by a single, precise strike of a clawed hand. The gunfire was deafening in the enclosed space, but it was also useless. The creature moved between the bullets, its trajectory unpredictable, its body presented as a target for fractions of a second before it was somewhere else. Garza was the last of the mercenaries to fire. Jordan heard his rifle cycle, 3 shots, 4, 5, each one a sharp, mechanical sound in the chaos. Then a sound that was not a gunshot, a wet, heavy impact, followed by a short, sharp exhalation that was not a scream but was worse than a scream because it was the sound of a man who had been winded by something that had hit him hard enough to stop his heart. Garza's body hit the floor 3 meters from Jordan. She did not look at him. She kept crawling. The creature did not pursue the crawlers. It did not need to. It had the group in the open, in the dark, in the one room where it was most powerful. It was not hunting them. It was harvesting them. Jordan could hear it moving through the group, A systematic, deliberate circuit, taking one person, then another, each taken with a sound that was different from the last. A snap, a tear, a gurgle, a wet thud, a silence. It was not killing them quickly. It was not killing them all. It was taking them one at a time, carrying them to the altar, adding them to the column, and returning for the next. The offering. The creature was making the offering. It was feeding the cage. Jordan reached the passage. Her hand found the edge of the opening, a narrow, vertical fissure in the limestone, barely wide enough for a human body, descending at a steep angle into darkness. She did not hesitate. She pushed herself into the fissure, feeling the stone close around her like a throat, the walls pressing against her shoulders and hips, the membrane-covered floor giving way to raw, wet limestone that was cold and rough against her skin. Behind her, Kelsey's hand found her ankle. "Keep going," Kelsey whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't stop." Courtney was next. She slid into the fissure behind Kelsey, her body shaking, her breathing a rapid, shallow panting that she could not control. Behind Courtney, the sounds of the massacre continued, screams, clicks, the wet, systematic sounds of the creature at work. The dome was being emptied. The column was being fed. Jordan crawled. The fissure was narrow, twisting, descending at an angle that made every meter a struggle. The limestone scraped against her skin, tearing the guano coating, exposing her flesh to the cold, wet stone. She could feel the membrane beneath her, thin here, barely present, but still pulsing, still alive, still connected to the organism that was, at this moment, consuming the people she had been standing with minutes ago. Behind her, Kelsey and Courtney crawled in silence. Behind them, the sounds of the dome grew fainter, the screams dimming, the clicking slowing, the wet sounds becoming less frequent as the creature ran out of victims. And then from the dome, a final sound, a voice, not a scream, not a gurgle, a voice, Thorne's voice, clear and coherent, saying words that Jordan could not make out, followed by a sound that she would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. The wet, rhythmic flapping of leather, and the systematic, surgical dismantling of a human throat. Then silence, total, absolute, suffocating silence. The silence of something that had finished eating and was now listening for what it had missed. Jordan crawled faster. The fissure widened slightly, then narrowed again, then turned sharply to the left. She could feel air, not the thick, warm, organic air of the cavern, but fresh air, cold air, air that carried the scent of earth and leaves and rain. The surface. The passage was leading to the surface. She crawled for what felt like hours. The stone scraped, the air grew colder, the darkness remained absolute. Behind her, she could hear Kelsey and Courtney breathing, the only proof that she was not alone, that the creature had not found the fissure that the bottleneck was holding. She did not speak. She did not stop. And then, without warning, the fissure ended. Not at a wall, not at a dead end, but at light. A faint, gray, blessed light. The light of an overcast sky filtered through a screen of roots and vegetation. The fissure opened onto the forest floor, 100 meters from the cenote's edge, concealed by a tangle of roots and hanging vines that made it invisible from more than a few feet away. Jordan pulled herself out of the fissure and onto the forest floor. The air hit her like a wall, cold, clean, the scent of wet earth, and decomposing leaves overwhelming after the copper-and-drought atmosphere of the cave. She lay on her back, staring up at the canopy, feeling the rain on her face, and she breathed. She breathed until her lungs stopped burning, until her heart rate began to slow, until the shaking in her hands subsided enough that she could clench them into fists. Kelsey emerged next, her face streaked with guano and blood and cave fluid, her eyes wide and glassy with shock. She pulled herself out of the fissure and collapsed beside Jordan, her breathing ragged, her body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline. Courtney came last. She was crying, not the loud, dramatic crying of someone in a movie, but the silent, involuntary weeping of someone whose body had exceeded its capacity for terror and was now venting the excess through tear ducts. She crawled out of the fissure, curled into a ball on the forest floor, and shook. 3 survivors out of 40. They lay in the rain for 10 minutes, saying nothing. The jungle sounds surrounded them, insects, birds, the distant rumble of thunder, and for the first time in days, those sounds were a comfort. They were the sounds of the surface, the sounds of the world they had almost lost. Then Kelsey spoke. Her voice was flat, clinical, the voice of a scientist reporting findings that she wished she did not have to report. There were offspring, she said. Jordan turned her head. What? In the membrane, when we were crawling, I looked. I shouldn't have, but I looked. The shapes in the ceiling, the ones we saw on the first drone sweep, they weren't dormant. They were developing, larval stage. Some of them were the size of dogs, some of them were the size of children. She paused. One of them opened its mouth. It didn't have teeth yet. It had holes like the adult, but smaller, unformed, growing. How many? Jordan asked. I don't know, dozens, maybe more. The membrane extends through the entire cavern system. We only saw a fraction of it. The thermal data showed. She stopped. She closed her eyes. The organism is reproducing. The containment isn't holding anymore. The cage is breaking down. The offerings, the bodies aren't enough. It needs more. It's been starving for centuries and now it's expanding. Jordan sat up. She looked at the cenote, visible through the trees, a dark, gaping hole in the earth, breathing its slow, copper-scented breath into the rain. She looked at the fissure they had emerged from, barely visible among the roots. She looked at Kelsey and Courtney, the only other people in the world who knew what was down there, who had seen it, who had survived it. We need to get out of here, Jordan said. Now, before anything else comes out of that fissure. They moved. Slowly, painfully, supporting each other, they made their way through the jungle toward the route they had mapped on the way in. The rain was heavy, the footing treacherous, the jungle as hostile as it had been on the first day, but they did not care. They were on the surface. They were alive. The sky was above them, gray and heavy and beautiful. They walked for 6 hours. By the time they reached the edge of the surveyed zone, where the jungle thinned and the terrain became navigable, they were exhausted, dehydrated, and barely functional. But they were moving, and movement was life. The secondary team found them at 1400 the next day. A helicopter, dispatched from Flores when the primary team's satellite phone had gone silent for 48 hours, spotted them from the air, stumbling through a clearing, their bodies coated in filth, their faces blank with shock. The helicopter landed on a ridge 100 meters away, and the rescue team, a medic, a pilot, and 2 local guides, ran to meet them. The survivors were wrapped in blankets, given water, and loaded into the helicopter. Courtney was sedated. Kelsey was treated for chemical burns from the cave fluid. Jordan refused treatment until she had spoken to the rescue team's coordinator, to whom she gave a terse, clinical account of what had happened. The cenote, the cavern, the creature, the massacre. She did not describe the gore. She did not describe the sounds. She gave coordinates and a body count and a recommendation that no one, under any circumstances, should return to the site. The helicopter lifted off. The 3 survivors sat in the cargo compartment, their backs against the bulkhead, their faces turned toward the windows. Below them, the jungle spread out in an unbroken green carpet, vast and ancient and indifferent. The cenote was invisible from the air, a dark smudge in the green, no larger than a coin, easily mistaken for a shadow. Jordan stared at it until it disappeared behind the tree line. Then she closed her eyes. The helicopter flew north. The sound of the rotors filled the cabin, a steady, mechanical rhythm that was, after the sounds of the cave, almost soothing. The medic was in the front compartment, monitoring Courtney's vitals. The pilot was on the radio, reporting their position. The 2 local guides were sitting on the cargo bench, their faces expressionless, their eyes on the survivors with a look that was not concern but recognition, the look of people who had heard the stories and had always known they were true. Kelsey was sitting across from Jordan. She had been silent since the rescue, her face turned toward the window, her breath fogging the glass. But as the helicopter crossed the ridge and the valley of the Petén Basin fell away behind them, she turned her head. Her eyes met Jordan's, and then she cocked her head very slightly to the side. A listening posture, the posture of someone who has heard something that they are not sure they are hearing. "What is it?" Jordan asked. Kelsey did not answer immediately. She held up a hand, wait, and tilted her head further. Her eyes were focused on something internal, some processing of a sound that was too faint, too high, too precise for normal human hearing. Her lips moved silently, shaping a word that she did not want to say. Then she said it. Clicking. Jordan felt the blood leave her face. She felt it go, felt the warmth drain from her cheeks, from her fingers, from the pit of her stomach, as if the creature were already there, already draining her, already adding her to the column. "Where?" she asked. Her voice was a whisper. Kelsey looked at the cargo compartment, at the luggage, at the equipment cases that the rescue team had loaded from the survivors' packs, at the heavy, hardened containers that contained the audio recorders, the sample kits, the tablets, the personal effects, the things that had been in the cave, that had been in the darkness, that had been in the presence of the organism. "Not outside," Kelsey said. "Inside the luggage compartment, behind the panel." Jordan turned slowly. She looked at the bulkhead that separated the cargo compartment from the helicopter's maintenance bay, a thin, riveted panel of aluminum that was vibrating with the rotor wash. Behind it, in the dark space between the cargo and the airframe, something was clicking. A rapid, staccato burst of biological percussion, precisely modulated, forming a pattern that was not random but was a map of the helicopter's interior, a map of the bodies inside it, a map of their positions and their heart rates and the heat of their hearts. "It doesn't see the light, it sees the heat of our hearts." The recording was right. It had always been right. And now, in the belly of the helicopter, in the dark, in the luggage, something that had no eyes was learning the shape of the world above. The clicking continued. It grew faster. It grew louder. And then beneath it, barely audible over the rotor wash, a second sound, a wet, rhythmic flapping, the sound of leather. The sound of a throat being systematically dismantled. The sound of something waking up. Jordan looked at Kelsey. Kelsey looked at Jordan. Neither of them screamed. There was no point. The sky was above them and the earth was below, and in the thin aluminum belly of the machine that carried them towards safety, something that had been sleeping for centuries was opening its mouth. The clicking stopped. And then, in the silence that followed, in the terrible, breathless silence of a helicopter cabin 2,000 feet above the Guatemalan jungle, something moved. The Threshold of Mashu. The sound was rhythmic, regular, almost mechanical in its precision, a scraping like metal against stone, like claws against limestone, like something vast and patient wearing away at the fabric of the world one grain at a time. "Doctor." Arash Kaviani heard it first, though he would not live long enough to understand what it meant, to comprehend the warning that was being delivered in a language older than human speech, older than human thought, older than the mountains themselves. He was on his knees in the cramped limestone chamber, his hands wrapped around the wire brush that he had been using to clean the ancient cuneiform symbols from the wall, and he was sobbing. The sobbing was not theatrical, not performative, not the expression of grief that might be expected from a man confronting the ruins of a lost civilization. It was the sobbing of a man who had seen something that his mind could not process, who had understood something that his intellect could not accommodate, who had glimpsed a truth so vast and so terrible that the only possible response was tears, was breakdown, was the collapse of rationality into the primitive refuge of raw emotion. Arash had spent 20 years studying the archaeology of the ancient Near East, had excavated sites from Ur to Nineveh to Persepolis, had handled artifacts that were older than the concept of civilization itself. He had thought himself immune to wonder, inured to mystery, protected by the armor of academic distance from the emotional impact of the past. He had been wrong. The symbols on the wall were not records of temple offerings or royal decrees or astronomical observations. They were warnings. Warnings written in a script that was older than the standard Babylonian cuneiform that Arash had spent his career deciphering. A script that belonged to an earlier age, a pre-Sumerian culture that had existed in the Zagros Mountains before the rise of the cities, before the invention of writing as Arash understood it, before the domestication of fire itself. The warnings described something that guarded the gate, something that had been created by Tiamat, not the mythological Tiamat of the Enuma Elish, but something else, something that the ancient writers had known by a name that Arash's translations could only approximate. The Girtablilu, the Scorpion Men, the guardians of the Threshold. But they were not men, they were not scorpions, they were something else, something that the warnings described in terms that were simultaneously precise and inadequate. Their eyes are the death of mortals, their venom is the liquefaction of flesh, their pincers are the gates of the underworld. Their tails are the pillars of heaven. Arash had read these descriptions with the skepticism of a scientist, had attributed them to the poetic imagination of ancient writers who had encountered dangerous wildlife, and had transformed their fear into mythology. He had been wrong about that too. The scraping sound continued, and Arash knew with a certainty that transcended observation and entered the realm of direct perception, that the sound was not coming from the wire brush in his hands, not from the wind outside the cave, not from any source that existed in the same dimension as the limestone chamber in which he knelt. The sound was coming from behind him, from the darkness at the end of the passage, from the space that he had not yet explored, that he had been told not to explore, that the warnings on the wall had explicitly forbidden him from entering. He turned slowly, his knees grinding against the stone floor, his hands trembling so violently that the wire brush fell from his fingers and clattered against the limestone with a sound that was shockingly loud in the enclosed space. The chamber was dimly lit by the LED lantern that he had placed on the floor beside him, its harsh white light casting shadows that were sharp and black against the pale walls. The passage behind him was dark, a rectangle of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, and from that darkness came the scraping, rhythmic and patient and immense. "It's not real," Arash whispered, and his voice was high, broken, the voice of a child confronting a nightmare. "It's not real, it's the wind, it's the mountain settling, But it was real, and he knew it was real, and the knowledge was in his body before it reached his mind, in the prickling of his skin and the hammering of his heart, and the sudden, catastrophic surge of adrenaline that made his vision swim and his bladder release in a warm flood that soaked his trousers and pooled on the stone beneath him. Something moved in the darkness, something massive, something that filled the passage from floor to ceiling and from wall to wall, something that was too large to exist in the space that contained it, and yet did exist, folding and compressing itself into dimensions that human geometry could not describe. Arash saw it, or saw enough of it, a glimpse that lasted less than a second, but that was sufficient to destroy him. A chitinous surface, dark brown and segmented, with joints that bent in directions that violated anatomy, and above the segments, emerging from the darkness into the edge of the lantern's light, an eye. Not a human eye, not an animal eye, something else. Something that was compound in a way that suggested not insect but architecture, not biology but engineering, something that was made of thousands of individual lenses arranged in a pattern that was simultaneously random and precise, each lens reflecting the lantern's light in a different color, producing a mosaic of brilliance that was beautiful and terrible and absolutely, completely deadly. The warnings on the wall had said that the mere sight of a Girtablilu could kill a mortal. Arash had dismissed this as superstition, as the exaggeration of ancient writers who had not understood the physiology of fear, who had attributed to supernatural causes what was merely the result of extreme stress on the human cardiovascular system. He had been wrong about that as well. The eye looked at him, or through him, or into him. The distinction was meaningless, the directionality of the gaze irrelevant to the effect, and Arash felt something happen in his brain, something that was not a thought or an emotion but a physical event, a rupture, a breach. It started in the occipital lobe where visual processing occurred, and it spread rapidly, following the pathways of neural connection like a fire through dry grass, producing a cascade of failures that was simultaneous and catastrophic. Blood vessels burst, flooding his cranial cavity with pressure that compressed the brain tissue and produced a headache of such intensity that it was indistinguishable from ecstasy. Neurons misfired, producing electrical storms that convulsed his body in spasms that dislocated his shoulders and shattered his teeth against each other. And the autonomic nervous system, overwhelmed by the input, simply shut down, producing a cardiac arrest that was so sudden, so complete, that Arash was dead before his body finished falling forward onto the stone floor. He died with his eyes open, the compound eye reflected in his dilated pupils, and the last thing he saw, the last thing any human being should ever see, was the Girtablilu emerging from the darkness, its massive form filling the passage, its pincers extending, its tail rising, its presence announcing itself with a sound that was not a scream but was the scraping, the endless, patient, rhythmic scraping that had been the soundtrack of his final minutes. He was the first casualty. He would not be the last. The team that assembled at the base of the twin-peaked limestone formation in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran was not a standard archaeological expedition. It was a private operation, funded by a client whose identity was known only to the expedition's director, a man named Colonel Eric Voss, who had retired from the British Army's Special Reconnaissance Regiment 5 years prior, and had since built a reputation as the premier organizer of extracurricular archaeological operations, ventures that combined the expertise of academic researchers with the security and logistical capabilities of military contractors. Voss was 52, tall and lean, with the weathered face and watchful eyes of a man who had spent his adult life in places where the distinction between survival and death was measured in milliseconds and millimeters. He had served in Northern Ireland, in Bosnia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in a dozen other theaters where the political situation had required the deployment of men who could operate in the shadows, who could gather intelligence without leaving footprints, who could kill if necessary and disappear if desirable. He had left the military not because he had lost his edge but because he had found something else, something that the military could not provide, a sense of purpose that was not defined by national interest or strategic objective, but by the pursuit of knowledge, the uncovering of secrets, the revelation of truths that had been buried for millennia. His client for this operation was a billionaire occultist named Vincent Harrow, an American who had made his fortune in hedge funds, and who had spent the past 3 decades converting that fortune into experiences that most people would describe as delusional, dangerous, or demonic. Harrow believed truly, deeply, obsessively believed, that the ancient myths of the Near East were not myths but histories, accounts of events that had actually occurred, descriptions of beings that had actually existed, records of technologies that had been lost to time but that could be recovered by those with the will and the resources to search for them. He had funded expeditions to Mount Ararat in search of Noah's Ark, to the empty quarter of Saudi Arabia in search of the lost city of Iram, to the jungles of Guatemala in search of the crystal skulls that were rumored to be repositories of ancient knowledge. Most of these expeditions had returned empty-handed, their participants dismissed by the academic establishment as crackpots and treasure hunters, their findings relegated to the margins of respectable discourse. But some of them had returned with evidence that was difficult to dismiss, artifacts that did not fit into any known archaeological framework, photographs that showed things that should not exist, samples that produced anomalous results in laboratory analysis. Harrow had collected this evidence, had organized it, had studied it with the same intensity that he had applied to financial derivatives and market trends. And he had concluded, with a certainty that bordered on fanaticism, that the ancient world had been populated by entities that were not human, not divine, but something else, something that existed in the spaces between categories, that defied the taxonomies of science and religion alike, that were waiting to be rediscovered by those who knew where to look. The Zagros Mountains were where he was looking now. Specifically, a geological anomaly that had been identified by satellite imaging 3 years prior, a twin-peaked limestone formation that was located at the precise coordinates that corresponded, in Harrow's calculations, to the mythological Mount Mashu, the twin peaks that had guarded the entrance to the underworld in the Epic of Gilgamesh. According to the epic, Mashu was the place where the sun entered and emerged from the earth, the threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead, guarded by scorpion men who were half man and half dragon and whose glance was death. Most scholars dismissed the description as poetic fantasy, as the imaginative embellishment of a landscape feature that had been familiar to the ancient Mesopotamians, but that had been transformed by storytelling into something supernatural. But Harrow was not most scholars. He believed that the scorpion men were real, that they were not mythological guardians but biological entities, or possibly technological entities, or possibly something else entirely, that had been created by a civilization older than Sumeria, older than Egypt, older than any known human society. And he believed that they were still there, in the Zagros Mountains, waiting at the threshold of the underworld for the next traveler to approach. He had hired Voss to lead an expedition to investigate the anomaly, to determine whether there was any substance to his theories, and to retrieve whatever evidence might exist. The team that Voss had assembled reflected the dual nature of the operation: half archaeologists, half security contractors, professionals from both fields who had been selected for their competence, their discretion, and their willingness to operate outside the frameworks of institutional oversight. Dr. Sarah Chen was the lead archaeologist, a specialist in Bronze Age Mesopotamia who had published extensively on the Uruk period, and who had a reputation for being both brilliant and difficult. She was 39, Chinese American with a sharp intellect and a sharper tongue, and she had accepted Harrow's offer, a salary that exceeded her university pay by a factor of 5, plus full funding for her research for the next decade, because she was tired of academic politics, tired of grant applications, tired of the slow, grinding machinery of institutional science. She wanted to make discoveries, not write proposals, and Harrow's money offered her the freedom to do so. Dr. Marcus Webb was the geologist, responsible for analyzing the limestone formation and determining whether it was natural or artificial, whether it had been formed by geological processes or by something else. He was 45, British, with a career that had taken him from the oil fields of the North Sea to the research laboratories of Cambridge, and he was skeptical of Harrow's theories to the point of open contempt. He was here for the money and for the science, not for the mythology, and he made no secret of his belief that the expedition would find nothing more interesting than an unusual rock formation. Alan Torres was the medic, a former Navy corpsman who had served with the Marines in Iraq and who had transitioned to civilian life by obtaining a physician assistant degree and specializing in expedition medicine. He was 34, Puerto Rican American, with a calm demeanor and a steady hand that concealed a mind that was always calculating, always assessing, always preparing for the worst-case scenario. He was here because Voss had requested him specifically, because they had served together in Helmand Province, and because Voss trusted him with his life. The security detail consisted of 6 men, all former special operations personnel from various NATO countries, all hired through a private military contractor that Voss had worked with for years. They were equipped with the latest tactical gear, weapons, and communications equipment, and they had been briefed on the expedition's objectives with the same thoroughness that Voss applied to every operation he led. They had not been told about Harrow's occultist theories. Voss had learned long ago that security personnel performed better when they were not distracted by speculation. But they had been warned that the site was located in a region that was technically off-limits to foreign researchers, and that their presence might attract attention from Iranian authorities or from local insurgent groups. They had established a base camp at the foot of the Twin Peaks, a cluster of tents and equipment containers that was camouflaged against satellite observation, and that was protected by a perimeter of motion sensors and night vision cameras. The camp was remote, isolated, accessible only by helicopter or by a 3-day trek through terrain that was among the most rugged in the world. They had been here for 2 weeks, conducting preliminary surveys, mapping the formation, analyzing samples, and waiting for the full team to arrive before beginning the excavation of the anomaly that Harrow's satellite imaging had identified. The anomaly was a massive, sealed portal that was located at the base of the western peak, its entrance hidden behind a curtain of limestone debris that had accumulated over millennia of weathering and rockfall. The portal itself was artificial. There was no doubt about that. Its surface was smooth, polished, inscribed with symbols that were visible even through the accumulated dirt and debris. But what was inside, what lay beyond the sealed entrance, was a mystery that had consumed Harrow's imagination, and that was now consuming the team's resources and attention. They had cleared the debris, revealing the portal's full dimensions. A rectangle of pale limestone that measured approximately 4 meters in height and 3 meters in width, its surface covered with cuneiform inscriptions that were older than any Sarah had ever encountered, older even than the proto-cuneiform of Uruk, older than the earliest known writing systems. The inscriptions were warnings, she had determined, though their precise content was still being deciphered. They described the Girtablilu, the Scorpion Men, the guardians of the Threshold, and they advised any traveler who encountered them to turn back, to flee, to never approach the gate under any circumstances. Arash Kaviani had been the team's epigrapher, the specialist responsible for translating the inscriptions and providing context for their meaning. He had been working on the wall inside the preliminary chamber when he had suffered his breakdown, when he had begun screaming about the eye and the scraping, and the guard that cannot be erased. The security personnel had found him on the floor of the chamber, dead, his face frozen in an expression of such profound terror that one of the contractors, a veteran of multiple combat deployments, had vomited at the sight. The official report, the report that Voss had sent to Harrow via encrypted satellite link, attributed Arash's death to a cerebral hemorrhage, a spontaneous rupture of a blood vessel that had been caused by the stress of high-altitude work and the psychological pressure of isolation. But Voss knew better. He had seen Arash's body, had examined the scene, had noted the wire brush that was still clutched in the dead man's hand, and the cuneiform symbols that had been partially erased from the wall. And he had seen something else, something that he had not included in his report. The marks on the floor, the scratches in the limestone that suggested something massive had dragged itself through the passage, something that was too large to fit but that had fit anyway, compressing and folding and squeezing itself through a space that should have been impassable. He had not shared this observation with the team. He had ordered the chamber sealed, had posted guards at the entrance, and had waited for instructions from Harrow. The instructions, when they arrived, were clear and unequivocal. Proceed with the excavation. Open the portal. Discover what lies beyond. Harrow did not care about Arash's death. Harrow cared about the gate, the threshold, the underworld that waited beyond, and he was willing to sacrifice as many people as necessary to reach it. Voss stood at the entrance to the preliminary chamber, looking at the sealed passage beyond which Arash had died, and he felt something that he had not felt since his first combat deployment. The cold, precise certainty that he was about to lead his people into something that was beyond their understanding, beyond their training, beyond their capacity to survive. He was a soldier, not a mystic, a pragmatist who believed in the evidence of his senses and the logic of his training. But he was also a man who had learned, through decades of experience, to trust his instincts, to listen to the small voice in the back of his mind that warned him when situations were deteriorating beyond the point of control. That voice was screaming now. It had been screaming since Arash's death, and it was getting louder with each hour that passed, with each new discovery, with each piece of evidence that suggested the ancient warnings were not fantasy, but were, in some terrible, incomprehensible way, literal descriptions of a reality that human science had not yet mapped. Colonel Alan Torres approached from the camp, his medical bag slung over his shoulder, his face concerned. The team's assembled. Dr. Chen wants to start the briefing. In a minute, Voss said, not turning from the portal. Sir, with respect. I said in a minute, Alan. Alan fell silent, standing beside his former commander in the shadow of the limestone peak, and they waited together, two men who had faced death in many forms and who were about to face it in a form that neither of them had imagined possible. The wind blew through the Zagros Mountains, carrying the scent of dust and stone and something else, something that was not natural, not geological, not anything that had a name in the vocabulary of human experience. And in the deep places beneath the peaks, in the passages that had been sealed for millennia, something stirred in the darkness, responding to the vibrations of human activity, to the sounds of voices and machinery, and the endless, patient curiosity that had been the driving force of human civilization, and that would now become its undoing. The Girtablilu were waiting. They had been waiting since before the first cities were built, since before the first words were written, since before the first human beings had walked upright on the plains of Africa. They were patient, they were eternal, and they were hungry. The threshold of Mashu was about to be crossed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The briefing tent was hot, the midday sun turning the canvas into a greenhouse that trapped the heat and amplified it, producing an atmosphere that was stifling despite the altitude. Voss stood at the front of the assembled team, his face expressionless, his posture military perfect, and he looked at the faces that looked back at him with expressions that ranged from professional focus to barely concealed anxiety. Dr. Sarah Chen sat in the front row, her laptop open on her knees, her fingers paused over the keyboard in a posture that suggested she was ready to take notes, but was waiting for something worth recording. Beside her, Dr. Marcus Webb sat with his arms crossed, his face set in the skeptical scowl that had become his default expression since the expedition's inception. Alan Torres was in the second row, his medical bag on the floor beside his boots, his eyes fixed on Voss with an attention that was both personal and professional, the gaze of a man who was watching his commander for signs of stress, of doubt, of the kind of mental deterioration that could doom an entire operation. The security contractors sat in the back rows, their weapons slung over their shoulders, their faces masks of professional neutrality that concealed whatever opinions they might have held about the mission, the client, or the dead epigrapher whose body was currently stored in a refrigerated container at the edge of the camp. There were 6 of them. Sergeant James "Jimmy" Callahan, a former Green Beret who served as the detail's second-in-command, Corporal Dmitry Volkov, a former Spetsnaz operative who had defected to the West a decade prior, Private First Class Kenji Nakamura, a former Japanese Special Forces soldier who had transitioned to private contracting after a dispute with his superiors, Lance Corporal Antoine Dubois, a former French Foreign Legionnaire who had served in Africa and the Middle East, Specialist Hassan al-Rashid, a former Jordanian Special Operations soldier who had been recruited by Voss for his knowledge of the region, and Private Sean O'Brien, a young Irishman who was on his first contract and who was trying too hard to appear experienced. Dr. Caviani's death was not a cerebral hemorrhage, Voss said, and the words fell into the tent like stones into still water, producing ripples of shock and confusion that were visible in the sudden straightening of postures, the widening of eyes, the exchange of glances that were both questioning and accusatory. "What?" Sarah Chen's voice was sharp, professional, the voice of someone who had been trained to challenge authority when authority made claims that contradicted evidence. The report said. "The report said what I told Harrow to put in it," Voss interrupted. "What I needed him to believe, so that he wouldn't pull the plug on this operation before we had a chance to understand what we're dealing with. But you all deserve the truth, because you're about to enter that chamber, and the truth might be the only thing that keeps you alive." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, meeting each gaze in turn, establishing the connection that was the foundation of leadership. "I see you, I know you, I will not lie to you about what matters." Arash Kaviani died because he saw something, Voss continued. Something in the passage beyond the preliminary chamber, something that was too large to fit in the space it occupied, too alien to be described in any language we possess, and too terrible for the human mind to process without catastrophic neurological failure. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage, yes, but the hemorrhage was caused by what he saw, not by any pre-existing condition or environmental stress. The thing in that passage, whatever it is, killed him with a glance. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the creaking of the tent's canvas in the wind and the distant sound of the generator that powered the camp's equipment. "That's insane," Marcus Webb said, and his voice was loud in the enclosed space, aggressive, confrontational. "You're saying some kind of monster killed Arash, some mythological creature. Colonel, with respect, you're a soldier, not a scientist, and you're letting your imagination." "I'm letting my eyes inform my judgment," Voss said, his voice calm, controlled, the voice of a man who had faced worse skepticism in worse situations and who had learned that conviction was more persuasive than volume. "I saw the marks on the floor, Dr. Webb. Drag marks. Scratch marks." Something massive moved through that passage after Arash entered it, something that compressed itself into dimensions that should have been impossible, that folded and squeezed and rearranged its anatomy to fit through a space that was barely wide enough for a human being. And I saw Arash's face. I saw the expression of someone who had witnessed something that broke him, physically and mentally, before he died. "Optical hallucination," Webb insisted. "High-altitude hypoxia, sensory deprivation in the dark chamber, any number of explanations that account for some of the evidence but not all of it," Voss interrupted. "Yes, I've considered them. I've considered every explanation that conventional science can provide, and they all fail to account for the marks on the floor, the scratches in the limestone, the warnings," Sarah Chen said, and her voice was different from Webb's, quieter, more thoughtful, the voice of someone who was considering rather than dismissing. "The inscriptions on the portal, the warnings about the Girtablilu, you think they're literal. You think the ancient writers were describing something real." "I think they were describing something they had seen," Voss said. "Something that had killed members of their communities, something that they had learned to fear and avoid. And I think they wrote those warnings in the hope that future generations would heed them." "And yet we're about to ignore them," Allen said, and his voice was flat, neither accusatory nor supportive, merely observational. "We're about to investigate them," Voss corrected. "There's a difference. Harrow wants the portal opened. He wants whatever is beyond it, and he's paying us enough that we can afford to be careful, to be prepared, to approach this situation with the seriousness it deserves. We're not going to barge in blindly. We're going to assess, to analyze, to determine whether the risks are manageable before we commit." "And if they're not manageable?" Nakamura asked, and his voice was soft, almost apologetic, the voice of someone who was asking a question that everyone was thinking. "Then we leave," Voss said. "Harrow's money is good, but it's not worth dying for. If the situation exceeds our capacity to control it, we extract, we report, we let someone else deal with it. He paused again, letting the words sink in, establishing the principle that would guide their actions in the hours and days to come. But I don't think it will come to that. I think we can handle this. I think we have the training, the equipment, and the intelligence to approach this situation safely and professionally. And I think that whatever is in that passage, whether it's a biological entity or a geological anomaly or something else entirely, is something that can be understood, measured, and managed. He said the words with conviction, but in the back of his mind, the voice that had been screaming since Arash's death whispered a different truth. You don't believe that. You don't believe it at all. The team entered the preliminary chamber 2 hours after the briefing, equipped with lights, cameras, sensors, and weapons. Voss led, with Callahan and Volkov flanking him, their rifles at the ready, their tactical lights cutting beams through the darkness that revealed walls of pale limestone, a floor of packed earth and stone, and a ceiling that was low enough to make the taller members of the team duck. The air was different here, Voss noticed immediately, different from the air outside in a way that he could not define, but that his body registered as wrong. It was still, motionless, as if the natural currents of convection and diffusion had been suspended, replaced by an artificial equilibrium that was maintained by forces he could not perceive. Air quality is normal, Webb reported, consulting a handheld sensor. Oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, all within expected parameters, but the pressure is slightly elevated, and the temperature is stable to within 1/10 of a degree. That's not natural, not in a cave system. What does it mean? Voss asked. It means something is maintaining this environment, Webb said. Something is preventing the normal exchange of air and heat that should be occurring. It's like the chamber is sealed, even though it's open at both ends. The portal, Sarah said, her voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. The sealed portal, it's not just a door, it's a barrier, a membrane, it's keeping something in or something out. They moved deeper into the chamber, their lights revealing more of the inscription-covered walls, the symbols that Arash had been cleaning when he died. The symbols were visible now, the wire brushes work partially completed, the cuneiform wedges standing out in sharp relief against the pale stone. Sarah photographed them, her camera's flash producing bursts of light that were painful in the darkness, and she read them aloud as she worked, translating the ancient Akkadian with a fluency that was the product of decades of study. Beware the threshold, she read. Beware the guardians. Their eyes are the death of mortals. Their venom is the liquefaction of flesh. Their pincers are the gates of the underworld. Their tails are the pillars of heaven. Turn back, traveler. Turn back, for no mortal may pass and live. Cheerful, Dubois muttered, and his voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a man who was using humor to manage fear. There's more, Sarah continued, moving along the wall, her light following the lines of text. The Girtablilu were created by Tiamat in the time before time, in the age before ages. They were made to guard the entrance to the underworld, to ensure that nothing mortal or divine might enter without permission. They are the perfect guardians, for they need no sleep, no food, no rest. They exist only to watch, to wait, to judge. And their judgment is death. Created by Tiamat, Webb repeated, and his voice was skeptical but less aggressive than before, the evidence of the strange environment beginning to chip away at his certainty. The primordial goddess, the mother of monsters. Biological weapons, Sarah read, and her voice changed, becoming hushed, almost reverent. The Girtablilu are not gods, they are not demons. They are biological weapons, crafted by the sorcerer priests of the Ancient Ones to ensure that the gate remains sealed. They were created from the stuff of the earth and the stuff of the stars, from the venom of scorpions and the strength of lions and the armor of crustaceans. They were made to be perfect killers, and they were made to be eternal. Turn back, traveler, turn back. The passage beyond the preliminary chamber was visible now, a rectangle of darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, producing an optical effect that was disorienting, almost nauseating. Voss approached it cautiously, his tactical light directed into the void, revealing nothing but more darkness, more nothingness, more of the same still, heavy air that seemed to resist movement. Arash died in there, Voss said, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something that was listening. He was cleaning the symbols on this wall and something emerged from that passage, something that killed him with a glance. Then we don't go in there, Alan said. We seal it, we report. We let Harrow send a team with proper equipment. And what equipment would that be? Voss asked. What equipment exists that can protect against a glance, against a neurological attack that operates faster than any bullet? Eye protection, Nakamura suggested. Mirrored visors, polarized lenses, if the attack is optical. It's not optical, Sarah said, and her voice was certain, the voice of someone who had read the texts and understood their implications. The warnings say their glance is death, not their eyes. Their glance, the act of looking, the exchange of attention, it's not about light, it's about perception, about consciousness, about the human mind encountering something that it's not equipped to process. Then we're defenseless, O'Brien said, and his voice was high, young, frightened. We're not defenseless, Voss said. We're cautious, we're prepared, and we're not going into that passage until we understand what we're facing. He turned from the darkness, his light sweeping across the chamber, and it caught something that he had not noticed before. A series of tablets, stone slabs that were propped against the wall near the entrance, their surfaces covered with the same ancient cuneiform that adorned the walls. Sarah moved toward them, her light joining his, and she gasped. Warning tablets, she said. Plural, multiple warnings. These are different from the wall inscriptions. These are portable. These were meant to be carried, displayed, placed at intervals to warn travelers approaching from any direction. She knelt beside the nearest tablet, her camera flashing as she photographed the surface, and she read aloud, her voice trembling slightly as the meaning of the words penetrated her professional detachment. This is the gate of Mashu, she read. This is the threshold of the underworld. Beyond this point the Girtablilu wait, they do not sleep, they do not eat, they do not rest, they exist only to guard, and they guard not with weapons but with presence. Their mere existence is fatal to mortals, their gaze induces madness, their venom dissolves flesh, their pincers crush bone. Turn back, traveler, turn back, for the gate is not meant for mortal eyes. There's another one, Webb said, moving to the next tablet. The Girtablilu are not malevolent, they are not cruel, they are simply perfect, perfect in their function, perfect in their design. They do not hate mortals, they do not love them, they simply eliminate them, as a sculptor eliminates stone to reveal the form within. They are the gardeners of the underworld, and mortals are the weeds in their garden. And a third, Alan said, his voice barely audible. Erasing the warning does not remove the guard. The guard is not the words. The guard is not the symbols. The guard is the gate itself. The gate is alive. The gate is aware. And the gate will not be deceived. The team stood in the chamber, surrounded by the warnings of the ancients, and they felt the weight of history pressing against them. The accumulated fear and wisdom of civilizations that had known something that modern science had forgotten, or had never known. The air was still, motionless, waiting, and the darkness of the passage seemed to pulse with a rhythm that was not heartbeat and not breathing but was something else, something that was older than both. We need to decide, Voss said, and his voice was quiet, serious, the voice of a man who understood that the decision he was about to make would determine not just the success or failure of the mission but the survival or death of every person under his command. Do we proceed, or do we withdraw? Proceed, Sarah said, and her voice was firm, the voice of the scientist who had dedicated her life to uncovering the secrets of the past and who would not turn back now, not when the greatest secret of all was within reach. We've come too far. We've sacrificed too much. Arash died for this. We owe it to him to finish what he started. "Proceed," Webb said, and his voice was less certain than Sarah's, but his professional pride would not allow him to be the one who advocated for retreat. "We need data. We need samples. We need to understand what's in that passage." "Proceed," Callahan said, and the security contractors nodded their agreement, their faces set in expressions of professional determination that concealed whatever fear they might have felt. Only Alan hesitated, his medical mind running through the scenarios, the possibilities, the outcomes that ranged from success to catastrophe. "I don't like it," he said finally. "I don't like the odds, I don't like the unknowns, but I'm with you. Whatever happens, I'll be there to pick up the pieces." Voss nodded, a short, sharp gesture that was both acknowledgement and decision. "Then we proceed, but we proceed carefully. We seal the passage behind us as we advance. We maintain communications, and at the first sign of anything anomalous, anything at all, we extract. No heroics, no sacrifices. We live to fight another day." They prepared their equipment, their lights, their sensors, their weapons. They checked their communications, their medical supplies, their escape routes. And they approached the portal, the sealed gate, the threshold of Mashu, with a caution that was the product of training and a courage that was the product of professionalism. But none of their training, none of their professionalism, none of their courage would be sufficient for what waited beyond the gate. The Girtablilu had been waiting for millennia, patient as stone, hungry as the grave, and the time of waiting was almost over. The threshold was about to be crossed, and the guardians were ready. The portal was sealed with a precision that suggested not natural formation but deliberate engineering. Its surface was smooth, polished to a finish that was mirror-like in its reflectivity, and the seam that separated the door from its frame was so fine that it was invisible to the naked eye, detectable only by the subtle change in texture that Sarah's fingertips discovered when she ran them along the edge. "It's not limestone," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the chamber's stillness. "Not entirely. There's something else in the composition, something metallic." "Let me see," Webb said, and he approached with his handheld spectrometer, a device that used X-ray fluorescence to identify the elemental composition of materials without requiring physical samples. He aimed it at the portal's surface, waited for the sensor to calibrate, and frowned at the reading. "That's impossible," he said. "What?" Voss asked. "The surface is pure calcium carbonate limestone, but the interior—" Webb paused, rechecking the reading, his skepticism warring with the evidence of his instruments. "The interior shows a layered structure. Limestone on the outside, but beneath that there's something else. Something that my sensor can't identify. It's not in the database." "Not in the database," Sarah repeated. "Marcus, your database contains every known mineral, every known alloy, every known—" "Every known material," Webb interrupted. "This isn't known. The sensor is returning readings that don't correspond to any established element or compound. The atomic structure it's wrong. It shouldn't exist." "Let me see," Voss said, and he took the spectrometer, examining the display with a soldier's pragmatism rather than a scientist's astonishment. "Whatever it is, it's what's keeping this door sealed. And whatever is keeping it sealed, we need to unseal it. Harrow wants the gate opened." "Harrow wants a lot of things," Alan said, and his voice was quiet, almost a mutter, but it carried in the still air of the chamber. "Most of them are bad ideas." "Noted," Voss said. "But we're not here to debate Harrow's judgment. We're here to do a job, and the job is to open that gate." They prepared the cutting equipment with a thoroughness that was born of professional caution and underlying fear. The thermite charges were standard military issue, designed for breaching metal doors and reinforced barriers, and they were placed along the seam of the portal with precision that was the product of Callahan's and Volkov's demolition training. The drills were industrial-grade, diamond-tipped, capable of penetrating the hardest known stone, and they were positioned at intervals along the portal's surface, ready to follow the thermite if the initial blast proved insufficient. "Everyone clear," Callahan ordered, and the team retreated to the far end of the chamber, taking cover behind a natural formation of fallen limestone that Voss had identified as the most defensible position in the space. Charges set. Detonation in 10 seconds. 9. 8. The countdown was ritual, a borrowed formality from military operations that provided structure to moments of chaos. Voss watched the portal, his eyes fixed on the seam where the thermite was packed, his body tensed against the shockwave that was coming. 3, 2, 1 fire in the hole. The explosion was not what they expected. Thermite burns rather than explodes, producing a reaction that is intense heat rather than percussive force, and the team had anticipated a gradual melting, a softening of the seal that would allow them to pry the portal open with crowbars and hydraulic jacks. But the thermite's contact with the portal's surface produced something else, something that was neither burning nor explosion, but was something in between, something that was not described in any of the manuals that Callahan had studied. The portal glowed, not with the orange-white light of burning metal, but with a pale blue luminescence that seemed to emanate from within the stone itself, as if the material were not being heated, but were being activated, stimulated, awakened. The glow spread from the points of contact, following the seam in both directions until the entire perimeter of the portal was illuminated with a light that was beautiful and terrible and absolutely alien. "What the hell?" Webb breathed. "It's working," Sarah said. "The seal it's responding, it's not resisting, it's—" The portal opened. Not gradually, not with the grinding of stone against stone that they had expected, but suddenly, completely, the two halves of the door swinging inward with a smoothness that suggested not ancient mechanism but something else, something that was powered by forces they could not perceive. The opening revealed not a chamber, not a passage, not any space that could be described in conventional architectural terms. It revealed a shaft. A vertical shaft, perfectly cylindrical, carved from the living rock with a precision that suggested not tools but growth, not excavation but formation. The walls were smooth, polished, reflective in a way that was disorienting, producing infinite regressions of light and shadow that made depth perception impossible. And the shaft descended, not gradually but vertically, dropping into a darkness that was absolute, a void that seemed to extend not just downward but inward, into dimensions that the human eye could not process. "Jesus Christ," O'Brien whispered, and his voice was barely audible above the sound that was emerging from the shaft. The sound was a hum, a low-frequency vibration that was felt in the bones rather than heard by the ears, a tone that resonated in the sternum and the teeth and the sinuses with a pressure that was almost painful. It was not constant but rhythmic, pulsing in a pattern that suggested not machine but organism, not mechanism but heartbeat. "What is that?" Dubois asked, and his hand was on his weapon, his knuckles white with tension. "The change of shift," Sarah said, and her voice was distant, almost dreamy, the voice of someone who was translating not just words but meanings, not just symbols but concepts. "The text said that opening the gate signaled a change of shift. I thought it was metaphorical. I thought it meant—" "A change of what?" Voss demanded. "Of guardians," Sarah said. "The Girtablilu, they don't rest, they don't sleep, they just switch. One takes over from another, an endless cycle, and opening the gate it disrupts the cycle, it forces a change." "Forces a change in what?" Alan asked. "In what's waiting for us," Sarah said, "in what's been waiting for millennia." The hum was getting louder, the vibration increasing in intensity until it was visible as well as audible, the team members' clothing rippling with the pressure, dust and small debris rising from the floor and hanging in the air as if suspended by the sound itself. And with the hum came a smell, a scent that was the opposite of the still, sterile air of the chamber. It was the smell of deep places, of subterranean spaces that had been sealed for geological epochs, of organic matter that had been preserved in anoxic environments, and was now exposed to oxygen for the first time in millennia. It was the smell of the Earth's interior, of the processes that occurred beneath the crust, of life forms that had evolved in darkness and pressure and isolation. "I'm getting readings off the charts," Webb said, his voice strained, his eyes fixed on a sensor that was displaying numbers that were not supposed to be possible. Radiation, electromagnetic fields, gravitational anomalies. This shaft, it's not just a hole in the ground, it's something else. Something that's producing effects that shouldn't exist. Radiation. Alan's voice was sharp, professional, the medic's instinct overriding his fear. "What kind? How much?" "Not ionizing," Webb said. "Not in the conventional sense. It's something else. Something that my sensor can't identify, but it's increasing. The closer we get to the shaft, the higher the readings." "Then we don't get closer," Alan said. "We back off, we seal the shaft, we explore," Voss said, and his voice was firm, the command voice that had carried him through decades of operations. "That's what we're here for, that's what Harrow is paying for. We descend, we document, we determine what's down there, and then we decide whether to proceed or withdraw." "Descend how?" Nakamura asked, and his question was practical, immediate, the voice of a man who was assessing the technical challenges of a difficult operation. "That shaft is vertical. We don't have climbing gear rated for that depth. We don't even know how deep it is." "We have rope," Callahan said. "Industrial climbing rope rated for loads up to 10,000 pounds. And we have harnesses, carabiners, descenders. We can rig a system." "A system for what?" Alan asked. "For lowering ourselves into a hole that we can't see the bottom of, into a space that's producing radiation and electromagnetic fields and God knows what else. Colonel, this is what we signed up for," Voss interrupted. "Every one of us knew the risks when we took Harrow's money. Every one of us knew that this expedition was unconventional, that the site was anomalous, that the outcomes were uncertain. We're not backing out now because things are getting weird. We knew they would get weird. That's the point." He turned to the shaft, his light directed into the void, and he continued in a voice that was quieter, more personal, less commanding. "I've seen things in my career that I can't explain, things that don't fit into any framework of understanding. I've learned that the world is bigger than we think, older than we know, and stranger than we can imagine. This shaft, whatever's down there, it's part of that bigger, older, stranger world, and I intend to see it." The team was silent for a moment, each member processing Voss's words, weighing their fear against their professionalism, their survival instinct against their curiosity. And one by one, they nodded. One by one, they committed. One by one, they accepted the risk that they were about to take. Callahan and Volkov rigged the rope system with a speed that was the product of years of training, anchoring the ropes to the limestone formation that Voss had identified as the most stable point in the chamber, running the lines through descenders and backup knots, testing every connection with a thoroughness that was both professional and ritualistic, a way of managing fear through competence. "Ropes ready," Callahan announced. "Who's first?" "I am," Voss said, and he stepped to the edge of the shaft, his light directed downward into the void. "I'm the commander. I go first." He clipped his harness to the rope, checked his connections, and began to descend, feeding the rope through his descender with a steady rhythm that was calm and controlled and absolutely necessary. The shaft's walls were smooth, featureless, offering no handholds or footholds, and the only light was the beam of his tactical light, which illuminated a cylinder of pale stone that seemed to extend downward forever. "I'm descending," he reported through his radio, his voice calm despite the adrenaline that was flooding his system. "Walls are smooth, no features, no." He stopped. His light had caught something, a shape in the darkness below, something that was not stone and not shadow but was something else, something that was moving, something that was ascending. "Contact," he said, and his voice was different now, tighter, higher. "Something's coming up, something's." The radio went dead. Not static, not interference but absolute silence, as if the signal had been swallowed by the shaft itself, consumed by the darkness that was rising to meet him. "Colonel," Callahan shouted into his own radio, but there was no response, no echo, no indication that Voss had heard or that anyone could hear. "Colonel, respond." "Pull him up," Allen shouted. "Pull him up now." Callahan and Volkov grabbed the rope, hauling upward with a strength that was the product of adrenaline and terror, and the rope moved, feeding through their hands, and then it went slack. Not taut, not resistant, but slack, as if the weight that had been on the other end was no longer there. They pulled the rope up, hand over hand, their muscles straining, their faces masks of effort and fear. And when the end of the rope emerged from the shaft, there was no Voss attached to it. Only the harness empty, dangling, the clip still closed, the fabric intact, but the body that had been inside it gone. "Where is he?" O'Brien asked, and his voice was high, broken, the voice of a young man confronting the reality of something that should not exist. "Where did he go?" "Down," Sarah said, and her voice was barely audible, a whisper that was swallowed by the humming that was still emerging from the shaft, louder now, more insistent, more alive. "He went down." "We need to get out of here," Allen said, and his voice was firm, commanding, the voice of a man who had seen enough and who was not willing to see more. "We need to seal this shaft and get out of here and never come back." "We can't seal it," Webb said, and his voice was distant, shocked, the voice of a man whose scientific worldview was crumbling around him. "The portal, it opened itself. It can't be closed, not by us, not by anything we have." "Then we run," Allen said. "We run and we don't look back." But they did not run, because the humming had stopped. The silence that followed was deeper and more absolute than any silence they had ever experienced, a void of sound that was the auditory equivalent of the darkness in the shaft, and in that silence they heard something else. A scraping, a rhythmic, patient, endless scraping, like claws against stone, like chitin against limestone, like something massive and ancient and hungry wearing away at the fabric of the world. It was the same sound that Arash Kaviani had heard in his final moments, the same sound that had been the soundtrack of his death, and now it was the soundtrack of theirs. "It's coming," Sarah whispered. "The change of shift, it's here." And from the darkness of the shaft, from the void that had swallowed Colonel Eric Voss, something emerged. It was not fast. It was not violent. It was simply inevitable, the slow, patient emergence of something that had been waiting for millennia and that could wait a few moments more. The first thing they saw was a pincer, massive and chitinous, curving from the darkness like a question mark, its surface dark brown and segmented, its inner edge serrated with teeth that were the size of human fingers. The pincer opened and closed with a sound that was like grinding stone, like snapping bone, like the closing of a gate that would never open again. And behind the pincer, emerging from the shaft with a slowness that was more terrible than any speed could have been, was the rest of it. The Girtablilu. The Scorpion Man, the Guardian, the biological weapon. It was massive, its body filling the shaft from wall to wall, its exoskeleton folding and compressing in ways that violated anatomy, that suggested not biology but origami, not evolution but design. The humanoid torso was visible above the mass of the body, arms that ended not in hands but in smaller pincers, a head that was a nightmare of compound eyes and mandibles and antennae that moved with a sensitivity that was almost tender, almost curious. And below the torso, emerging from the shaft in segments that were each larger than a human being, was the tail. The scorpion tail, segmented and armored, rising to a point that was lost in the darkness above, a stinger that was the size of a spear and that glistened with venom that was visible even in the dim light of the chamber. "Don't look at it," Sarah screamed, and her voice was raw, desperate, the voice of someone who had read the warnings and understood their meaning. "Don't look at its eyes." The warning said the glance. But it was too late. The creature's head turned, the compound eyes fixing on the team with an attention that was simultaneous and infinite, each lens reflecting their faces in miniature, and the effect was immediate, catastrophic, and absolutely fatal. Private Sean O'Brien looked. His eyes met the creature's, or met the reflection of his own eyes in the creature's compound lenses, and something happened in his brain, something that was physical and immediate and irreversible. He stiffened, his body going rigid as if shocked by electricity, and then he convulsed, a violent seizure that snapped his spine in 3 places and sent him crashing to the floor, his limbs flailing in a spasm that broke his own bones with the force of his muscles contracting beyond their limits. He died in seconds, his brain hemorrhaging from the rupture of multiple blood vessels, his heart stopping from the electrical storm that the creature's gaze had induced in his nervous system. And he died with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling with an expression that was not peaceful but was something else, something that looked almost like understanding, almost like recognition. "Run!" Alan screamed, and the word was unnecessary because everyone was already running, scattering like insects from a light, their professionalism shattered by the reality of what they were facing. But the Girtablilu did not pursue them. It simply waited, patient as stone, at the threshold of the shaft, its pincers opening and closing with a rhythm that was almost meditative, almost content. The change of shift was complete, the guardian had arrived, and the purge was about to begin. The survivors fled through the passage that led from the chamber to the surface, their lights cutting frantic beams through the darkness, their boots scraping against the limestone floor in a cacophony of panic that echoed off the walls and returned to them as the sound of their own terror. There were 7 of them now: Sarah Chen, Marcus Webb, Alan Torres, Jimmy Callahan, Dmitry Volkov, Kenji Nakamura, and Antoine Dubois. 7 human beings who had entered the mountain as professionals and who were now reduced to prey, fleeing from a predator that they could not see, could not understand, and could not hope to escape. The Girtablilu did not pursue them immediately. It remained at the threshold of the shaft, its massive form filling the passage, its compound eyes reflecting the light of the dropped lanterns in a mosaic of brilliance that was beautiful and terrible. It was evaluating them, Sarah realized, her academic mind struggling to impose order on chaos. The warnings had described the creature as a guardian, a judge, an entity that existed to determine who might pass and who might not. And now it was judging them, tasting the air with its antennae, feeling the vibrations of their panic through the stone, assessing them with senses that were alien and perfect. "It's not following," she gasped, her lungs burning, her legs trembling from the exertion of the flight. "It's not, it's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Dubois demanded, his weapon raised, his eyes scanning the darkness behind them for any sign of pursuit. "For us to come back," Sarah said. "The warning said the gate is not meant for mortals. The guardian doesn't chase, it waits, it guards, and if we try to leave—" "We're not trying to leave," Callahan interrupted. "We're getting the hell out of here. Harrow can find someone else to open his gate." "But the gate is already open," Webb said, and his voice was hollow, defeated. "We opened it, and we can't close it. The creature, it's out. It's in the mountain. And if we go back to the surface, if we try to leave—" "Then we go back armed," Callahan said, and he checked his rifle with a professionalism that was the product of years of training, years of combat, years of facing death and surviving. "We have weapons. We have explosives. We have—" "We have nothing," Alan said, and his voice was calm, clinical, the voice of a man who had accepted the reality of their situation and was now calculating the odds of survival. "O'Brien died because he looked at it, because he made eye contact. You can't fight something that kills you with a glance. You can't shoot something that doesn't need a body to destroy you." "Then we don't look at it," Callahan said. "We move with our eyes down, we navigate by touch, we—" "Colonel Voss didn't look at it," Volkov said, and his voice was quiet, almost thoughtful, the voice of a man who was processing information rather than reacting to it. Voss was descending. He wasn't looking at the creature. He was looking down, and something took him anyway. "The shaft," Nakamura said. "Something in the shaft, something that reached up and pulled him down," Webb finished. "We felt the rope go slack. He didn't fall, he was taken." The silence that followed was deeper than the darkness, a void of sound that was filled only by their breathing and the distant, rhythmic scraping that was the creature's movement, the sound of chitin against stone that was both patient and inevitable. "We need to find another way out," Alan said, "a route that doesn't go past the creature, a passage that leads to the surface without passing through the chamber." "There isn't one," Sarah said. "We've mapped this section. There's only one entrance, one exit. The way we came in is the only way out." "Then we make a new way," Callahan said. "We have explosives, we have tools, we blast our way through the rock." "We're 200 meters below the surface," Webb said. "We'd need industrial mining equipment to blast through that much limestone. We don't have." "Then we fight," Callahan said, and his voice was hard, determined, the voice of a soldier who would rather die fighting than running. "We go back to the chamber. We set up a perimeter. We engage the creature with everything we have, and we either kill it or we die trying." "You can't kill a god," Sarah whispered. "It's not a god," Callahan snapped. "It's an animal, a big, ugly, dangerous animal, and animals can be killed." He turned and began moving back toward the chamber, his rifle at the ready, his tactical light sweeping the passage ahead. Volkov followed, then Dubois, then Nakamura, the security contractors forming a defensive formation that was professional and futile. Webb hesitated, then followed, his scientific curiosity warring with his survival instinct. Sarah stood alone for a moment, the archaeologist who had led them to this moment, who had translated the warnings and failed to heed them, and then she too moved forward, her steps slow and reluctant. Only Alan remained behind, his medical mind running through the scenarios, the possibilities, the outcomes. He had served with Voss in Helmand, had watched men die in combat, had learned that courage was not the absence of fear but the acceptance of fear as a constant companion. But this was different. This was not combat. This was not a human enemy with human weaknesses and human motivations. This was something else, something that operated on principles that he could not understand, and his training, his experience, his knowledge were all inadequate to the reality that confronted him. "Alan," Callahan's voice echoed from the passage ahead, "move your ass." He moved. He moved because staying still was worse, because the darkness behind him was more frightening than the darkness ahead, because the human need for companionship outweighed the human need for safety. He followed the others back toward the chamber, toward the creature, toward the confrontation that would determine whether any of them survived. They found the creature in the same position they had left it, standing at the threshold of the shaft, its massive form silhouetted against the blue luminescence that still emanated from the portal's surface. It had not moved, or if it had moved, it had returned to its position, patient and eternal and absolutely terrifying. "Eyes down," Callahan ordered, and his voice was a harsh whisper. "Everyone, eyes on the floor, navigate by peripheral vision. Don't make direct contact." They spread out along the walls of the chamber, their weapons raised, their lights directed at the floor, their attention focused on the sounds and vibrations rather than the sight of the creature. Callahan took the center position, his rifle aimed at the creature's torso, his finger on the trigger. "On my mark," he said, "we open fire, concentrate on the head, the eyes." "Don't look at the eyes," Sarah hissed. "I know," Callahan said. "Aim for the center of mass, the torso, the junction between the humanoid upper body and the scorpion lower body. That's the weak point. That's where we—" The creature moved. It was not fast, not in the conventional sense, but it was sudden, a shift of position that covered the distance between the shaft and Callahan in a single fluid motion that was both scorpion and human, both arthropod and mammal. The massive pincer that had been visible at the shaft's entrance was now in the chamber, and it caught Callahan before he could fire, the curved chitinous blade closing around his torso with a force that was measured and deliberate. Callahan screamed, a sound that was shockingly loud in the enclosed space, and he fired his rifle, the reports deafening, the muzzle flash illuminating the chamber in strobing bursts that revealed the creature in fragments. A segment of exoskeleton here, a joint there, the compound eyes reflecting the light in 1,000 simultaneous glimmers. The bullet struck the creature's body and ricocheted, producing sparks that were visible against the chitinous armor, but they did not penetrate, did not wound, did not even slow the creature's movement. The pincer closed, and Callahan's scream was cut short by the sound of his ribs collapsing, the bones snapping like dry twigs under the pressure. The pincer was serrated on its inner edge, and the serration caught in Callahan's flesh, producing a tearing sound that was audible above the gunfire, a wet ripping that suggested not simple crushing but deliberate evisceration. Blood sprayed from the wounds, painting the creature's chitin in a pattern that was almost decorative, almost artistic, and Callahan's body convulsed, his legs kicking in a spasm of automatic reflex that produced a tapping sound against the limestone floor. The creature lifted him, the pincer raising Callahan's body to the level of its head, and it extended its neck, a neck that was not human but was segmented and flexible, capable of extending and retracting with a serpentine fluidity, and it examined him. The antennae moved over his face, tasting his sweat, his blood, the chemical signature of his terror. And the mandibles opened, revealing not teeth but something else, something that was the opposite of teeth, a smooth, muscular interior that was the color of old ivory, and that glistened with a fluid that was not saliva but was something else, something that smelled of acid and ammonia and ancient decomposition. "Jimmy," Volkov shouted, and he opened fire, his weapon on full automatic, the bullet striking the creature's head and neck in a pattern that was desperate and futile. Dubois and Nakamura joined him, the three of them producing a barrage of fire that was deafening in the enclosed space, the muzzle flashes producing a continuous illumination that was both blinding and revealing. Creature did not flinch. It did not recoil. It simply continued its examination of Callahan, the mandibles closing over the soldier's head with a gentleness that was obscene in its intimacy, and then it began to squeeze. Not crush. The creature was too precise for that, but compress, the muscular walls contracting in a pattern that was surgical, deliberate, the pressure increasing gradually until Callahan's skull began to deform, the bones of his face shifting and cracking under the force. His eyes bulged, the intraocular pressure increasing beyond what the delicate tissues could withstand, and then they ruptured, the vitreous humor spraying from the sockets in a clear fluid that mixed with the blood from his crushed torso. His jaw dislocated, the mandibles separating from the maxilla with a sound that was audible even above the gunfire, and his tongue protruded from his mouth, swollen and purple, as the pressure in his head exceeded the capacity of his anatomy. And then the creature released him, dropping his body to the floor with a sound that was wet and heavy, and it turned its attention to the three security contractors who were still firing, their weapons producing sparks and smoke, and emptying their magazines in a futile expenditure of ammunition that was the last expression of their professionalism. Volkov was the next to die. He had reloaded, his movements automatic, trained, and he was raising his weapon when the creature's tail descended, the massive stinger striking him in the back with a force that drove him to his knees, the chitinous point penetrating his body armor as if it were paper, sliding between his ribs and emerging from his chest in a spray of blood and tissue. But the stinger was not the killing blow. The venom was. It entered Volkov's body in a quantity that was measured and deliberate, not the defensive spray of a frightened scorpion, but the calculated injection of a predator that understood its prey's physiology better than the prey understood itself. The venom was not a simple neurotoxin, not a fast-acting poison that produced paralysis and death. It was something else, something that the ancient warnings had described as the liquefaction of flesh. And Volkov felt its effects immediately, terrifyingly, impossibly. It started in his chest, where the stinger had entered, a burning sensation that was not pain but was something else, something that was closer to dissolution than to injury. He looked down at his chest, at the point where the stinger emerged, and he saw that the wound was not bleeding but was weeping, producing a clear fluid that was not blood but was something else, something that was the color of lymph and the consistency of water. And the flesh around the wound was changing, softening, losing its structural integrity, becoming something that was closer to liquid than to solid. What? He tried to speak, but his voice emerged as a gurgle, and he realized that his throat was softening too, his larynx losing its rigidity, his vocal cords dissolving into the fluid that was filling his airway. He tried to breathe, but his lungs were no longer functioning, the alveoli collapsing as the tissue liquefied, the oxygen transfer failing as his pulmonary system transformed from organ to soup. He was conscious through all of it. The venom did not produce unconsciousness, did not spare him the experience of his own dissolution. He felt every moment, every stage, every incremental transformation of his body from solid to liquid, from living tissue to organic fluid. He felt his heart struggling to beat in a chest cavity that was filling with fluid, the muscle pumping uselessly against a medium that was too liquid to support contraction. He felt his brain softening in his skull, the neural tissue losing its structural integrity, the synapses failing as the neurons dissolved into the fluid that was filling his cranial cavity. And he felt the creature's attention, not hostile but evaluative, watching him with compound eyes that were simultaneously blind and all-seeing, assessing the effectiveness of its venom, the completeness of its kill, the efficiency of its biological weapon. He died sitting upright, his body held in position by the stinger that was still embedded in his back, and when the creature withdrew the stinger, his body collapsed, not falling but flowing, spreading across the floor in a pool of fluid that was the color of pale urine and that smelled of ammonia and decay. His bones were visible in the pool, stripped of flesh by the venom's action, bleached white and clean and utterly bare, as if they had been picked by vultures and bleached by the sun for years rather than dissolved in seconds. Dubois and Nakamura had stopped firing, their weapons empty, their ammunition expended in a barrage that had produced no visible effect on the creature. They stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the pools of fluid that had been Volkov and Callahan, their minds struggling to process what they had witnessed. "Run," Nakamura whispered, and the word was barely audible, a breath rather than a sound. They ran, not toward the surface but deeper into the mountain, into passages that they had not explored, into darkness that was absolute and that offered no hope of escape, but that was preferable to the creature's presence. The creature did not pursue them immediately. It had other prey to evaluate, other targets to process, and it turned its attention to the three who had not run: Sarah, Webb, and Allen. Sarah was on her knees, her hands pressed against her temples, her eyes squeezed shut, her body shaking with sobs that were the aftermath of shock and the precursor to breakdown. Webb stood beside her, his face pale, his hands empty, his scientific mind having retreated to a place where observation was still possible, where data could still be collected even in the face of annihilation. Allen was crouched beside them, his medical bag forgotten, his eyes fixed on the creature with an attention that was clinical, evaluative, the gaze of a man who was trying to understand the anatomy of death. The creature approached them with a slowness that was terrible in its patience, its massive body filling the chamber, its exoskeleton scraping against the walls in a sound that was the auditory equivalent of the scraping that Arash had heard in his final moments. The pincers opened and closed with a rhythm that was almost meditative, and the tail rose above its body, the stinger glistening with the remnants of Volkov's venom. "Don't look at it," Sarah whispered, her eyes still closed, her voice barely audible. "Don't look at its eyes," the warning said. "I know," Alan said, and his voice was calm, the calm of a man who had accepted his fate and was now simply waiting for it to arrive. "I know." But the creature did not attack them. It paused, its head tilting to one side in a gesture that was almost curious, almost puzzled, and the antennae moved over them, tasting their sense, their fear, their essence. And then it withdrew, the head turning away, the body shifting to present its flank rather than its face, and it moved past them, flowing toward the passage that Dubois and Nakamura had taken, leaving them alive and trembling in the chamber that was now filled with the remains of their companions. "Why?" Webb asked, and his voice was hollow, empty. "Why didn't it kill us?" "Because we're not ripe," Sarah said, and her voice was distant, dreamy, the voice of someone who was translating not words but meanings, not texts but truths. The warning said the Girtablilu don't just kill, they judge, they evaluate, they wait for the right moment, and the right moment hasn't come yet. "Then when?" Alan asked. "When we've suffered enough," Sarah said, "when we've ripened." They sat in the chamber, surrounded by death, and they listened to the sounds of the hunt that continued in the passages beyond, the scraping and the screams and the wet, rhythmic sounds of the creature's work. And they understood with a certainty that was beyond doubt that they were not survivors but were merely postponed, that the creature's withdrawal was not mercy but was patience, that the time of their death would come when the creature decided, not when they chose. The Girtablilu was hunting, and the night was long and the mountain was deep, and the threshold had been crossed, and there was no going back. Only forward, only down, only into the darkness where the guardian waited, patient and eternal and absolutely, completely deadly. They found the secondary chamber by accident, or perhaps by design, following a passage that seemed to lead nowhere until it opened into a space that was larger than the preliminary chamber, higher ceilinged, drier, with walls that were smooth and featureless, and that suggested not natural formation but deliberate construction. The chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 20 meters in diameter, with a single entrance that was narrow enough to be defensible, and a ceiling that was high enough to allow them to stand upright without ducking. "We can seal this," Webb said, his voice hoarse from dust and terror, his hands already moving to pile loose stones against the entrance. "We can block the passage. The creature is too big to fit through a narrow gap." "You saw what it did," Alan said. "It compressed itself, it folded, it moved through spaces that were too small for it." "That was the main passage," Webb insisted. "This is narrower, much narrower, and the walls are solid limestone. It can't." "It can move through porous limestone," Sarah said, and her voice was flat, affectless, the voice of someone who had read the warnings and understood their implications too late. The warning said, "The guardian moves through stone as a fish moves through water." I thought it was metaphor. I thought it meant the creature was agile, that it could climb. But it wasn't metaphor. It was literal. "Literal how?" Alan asked. "The exoskeleton," Sarah said. "The chitin. It's not solid, it's porous. The creature can compress itself, fold itself, reduce its volume by forcing fluid through the pores in its shell. And if the pores are small enough, if the stone is porous enough, it can move through the rock itself," Webb finished, and his voice was hollow, the voice of a man whose last hope had just been extinguished. "Then we're not safe here," Alan said. "We're not safe anywhere." "But it hasn't attacked us yet," Webb said, and there was a desperation in his voice that was almost pathetic, almost childlike. "It passed us by. It went after Dubois and Nakamura. Maybe it doesn't want us. Maybe we're ripening," Sarah said. "That's what the warning said. The Girtablilu don't kill immediately. They wait. They judge. They let the prey mature, develop, become." "Become what?" Alan demanded. "Worth killing," Sarah said. "The creature isn't just hunting for food. It's hunting for meaning, for purpose. It's fulfilling its function, and its function requires." She stopped, her head tilting to one side, her eyes widening as a sound reached them from somewhere in the darkness beyond the chamber. It was not the scraping of chitin against stone. It was something else, something rhythmic, something that was almost clicking, Alan whispered. The creature's tail, it's hitting the stone. The sound was unmistakable once identified. A regular, percussive tap-tap-tap. The sound of the creature's segmented tail striking against the limestone in a pattern that was not random but was deliberate, almost musical. It was coming from multiple directions simultaneously, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor, as if the creature were surrounding them, encircling them, communicating with others of its kind in a language that was older than speech. "It's not alone," Sarah breathed. "The warning said the guardians were plural, the Girtablilu, not one, many." "How many?" Webb asked, and his voice was barely audible. "The text said 7 for each gate," Sarah replied. 7 guardians, 7 judges, 7 executioners. "And we opened the gate," Alan said. "We signaled the change of shift, we." The wall behind Webb exploded. Not with fire or force, but with movement, the limestone crumbling as something massive pushed through it from the other side. The porous stone parting like wet paper as the creature's body compressed and squeezed and emerged into the chamber with a violence that was sudden and absolute and utterly terrifying. Webb was closest to the breach, and he had no time to react, no time to run, no time even to scream. The creature's pincer caught him around the waist, the curved blade closing with a force that bisected his body at the navel, producing a spray of blood and viscera that painted the walls in a pattern that was simultaneously random and deliberate, as if the creature were not just killing but decorating, not just destroying but creating. Webb's upper body fell to the floor, his legs still held in the pincer, and he was still alive, still conscious. His eyes wide with shock and his mouth opening and closing in a silent scream that produced no sound because his diaphragm had been severed and his lungs had collapsed. He looked at his own legs, held aloft in the creature's grip, and he tried to reach for them, his arms flailing in a gesture that was both pathetic and terrible, the last expression of a mind that could not accept the reality of its own destruction. The creature dropped the legs, and they fell beside the torso with a sound that was wet and heavy, and it turned its attention to the rest of the chamber, its compound eyes reflecting the light of the dropped lanterns in a mosaic of brilliance that was beautiful and deadly. Sarah and Alan scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the far wall, their eyes squeezed shut, their hands clasped in a grip that was painful and necessary. They could feel the creature's attention, not as a physical force, but as a pressure against their minds, a weight that was psychological and spiritual and absolutely overwhelming. "Don't look," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't look, don't think, don't." But Alan looked. Not at the creature's eyes, his own eyes were squeezed shut, but at the creature itself, at the shape of it, at the shadow that it cast against the wall. And what he saw, or thought he saw, was worse than anything he could have imagined. The creature was not one entity but many, or rather, it was one entity that was simultaneously multiple. The shadow on the wall was not the shadow of a single body, but of several, overlapping and interpenetrating, as if the creature existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, as if its physical form was merely the intersection of a larger, more complex geometry with the limited space of three-dimensional reality. He saw the outline of the scorpion body, the humanoid torso, the multiple limbs and pincers and stingers, but he also saw something else, something that was not part of the creature's anatomy but was part of its essence. A web, a network, a structure of connection that extended from the creature into the walls and floor and ceiling, into the stone itself, into the mountain, into the earth. "It's connected," he whispered, and his voice was distant, dreamy, the voice of someone who was seeing something that should not be visible. "It's connected to everything. The stone, the mountain, the earth. It's not just a creature, it's a node, a point of intersection." "Alan, stop," Sarah hissed, squeezing his hand with a force that was meant to shock him back to reality. Stop looking, stop thinking, just. But it was too late. The creature had noticed his attention, his perception, his attempt to understand what was fundamentally incomprehensible. It turned toward him, the head lowering, the antennae extending, and it emitted a sound that was not the scraping or the clicking but was something else, something that was closer to language than to noise, a sequence of tones and vibrations that was complex and structured and terrifyingly intelligent. "It's speaking," Alan said, and his voice was filled with wonder and horror in equal measure. "It's trying to communicate." "It's trying to kill you," Sarah said. "Alan, close your eyes, close your mind, don't." The creature struck. Not with its pincers, not with its stinger, but with its tail, the massive appendage descending with a speed that was shocking in its suddenness. The stinger aimed not at Alan's body but at the space beside him, the space where Sarah was pressed against the wall, her eyes squeezed shut, her face turned away. The stinger struck the limestone beside Sarah's head, penetrating the stone with a force that shattered it, producing a spray of fragments that cut her face and neck in a pattern of wounds that were superficial but that were painful and shocking. She screamed, her eyes opening involuntarily, and in that moment of opened eyes, she saw the creature. Not the creature's shadow, not the creature's outline, but the creature itself, in all its terrible, impossible, incomprehensible reality. She saw the compound eyes, the thousands of lenses reflecting her face in miniature, and she felt the same thing that Arash had felt, the same thing that O'Brien had felt. The neurological overload, the catastrophic failure, the rupture of blood vessels and neurons and synapses that produced a death that was instantaneous and absolute. She did not scream. She did not convulse. She simply stopped, her body going limp against the wall, her eyes open and staring, her face frozen in an expression that was not peaceful but was something else, something that looked almost like understanding, almost like acceptance. Alan caught her as she fell, lowering her body to the floor with a gentleness that was automatic, professional, the gesture of a medic who had handled the dead many times before. He checked her pulse, her breathing, her pupils, and he found nothing. No heartbeat, no respiration, no response to light. She was dead, killed by a glance, by a perception, by the simple act of seeing something that the human mind was not equipped to process. "No," he whispered, and his voice was broken, the voice of a man who had lost everything. "No, Sarah, no." But Sarah was beyond hearing, beyond feeling, beyond anything that human words could reach. She had crossed the threshold, not as a traveler but as a victim, and she was now on the other side, in the darkness where the Girtablilu waited, where the guardians judged, where the gate was open and the purge was complete. Alan was alone, the last survivor, the final witness, the only human being in the chamber who was still breathing, still conscious, still alive. And the creature turned its attention to him, the compound eyes reflecting his face in 1,000 simultaneous images, and it waited. "Do it," Alan said, and his voice was calm, the calm of a man who had accepted his fate. "Do it, kill me, I'm ready." But the creature did not kill him. It extended its antennae, tasting the air around him, evaluating him, judging him, and then it withdrew, the head turning away, the body shifting to present its flank, and it moved back through the breach in the wall, flowing into the stone like water into sand, disappearing with a slowness that was terrible in its patience. Alan was left alone in the chamber, surrounded by the bodies of his companions, the ruins of his expedition, the evidence of his failure. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and he stared at the space where the creature had been, and he tried to understand why he was still alive. The answer came to him slowly, gradually, emerging from the fragments of memory and observation that had accumulated in his mind since the expedition's beginning. The creature had not killed him because he was different, because he was not a threat, because he was blind. Not completely blind, not in the medical sense, but partially blind, the result of a childhood accident that had damaged the retina of his left eye, leaving him with vision that was functional but impaired, depth perception that was flawed, peripheral vision that was limited. He had never mentioned it to the team, had never considered it relevant to the expedition's objectives, but now he understood that it was the only thing that had saved him. The creature's fatal gaze required binocular vision, required the full processing capacity of both eyes working in concert. With one eye damaged, Alan's brain could not process the creature's image in the way that produced neurological overload. He could see the creature, could perceive its shape and movement, but he could not see it completely, could not see it as it truly was, and that incompleteness was his protection, his shield, his salvation. "I'm blind," he whispered, and the words were a revelation, a prayer, a spell of protection. "I'm blind, and it can't kill me." But he knew with a certainty that was beyond doubt that the creature would return, that it would evaluate him again, judge him again, and that eventually it would find a way to kill him, a method that did not require the gaze, a technique that did not depend on vision. The creature was patient. The creature was eternal. And the creature was thorough. He needed to escape, not just from the chamber, but from the mountain, from the gate, from the threshold that had been crossed and could not be uncrossed. He needed to reach the surface, to contact the outside world, to warn them about what had been released, what was waiting, what was coming. He stood up, his legs trembling, his body weak from shock and dehydration and the aftermath of terror. He looked around the chamber, at the bodies of his companions, at the ruins of his expedition, at the breach in the wall where the creature had emerged and withdrawn, and he made a decision. He would not go back the way they had come. The main passage was blocked by the creature, by the gate, by the shaft that led to the underworld. He would find another way, a passage that they had not explored, a route that the creature did not know. He moved through the chamber, stepping over Webb's bisected body, around Sarah's collapsed form, past the debris of the creature's emergence. He found a passage that led deeper into the mountain, a narrow crawl space that was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and he entered it, crawling on his belly through darkness that was absolute, his only guide the touch of his hands against the stone. The passage was long, tortuous, claustrophobic in a way that produced panic even in a mind that had already experienced the worst that the mountain could offer. He crawled for what felt like hours, his knees bleeding, his elbows raw, his breath coming in shallow gasps that were the only sound in the enclosed space. And behind him, always behind him, he heard the scraping, the clicking, the rhythmic sounds of the creature's movement through the stone. It was following him. Not pursuing, not chasing, but accompanying, escorting, herding him toward whatever destination it had chosen for him. It knew where he was going. It knew every passage, every chamber, every crevice in the mountain. It was the mountain in some terrible, fundamental way, and he was crawling through its body, through its veins, through its consciousness. He emerged from the crawl space into a chamber that was larger than any he had seen before. A cathedral of stone that was illuminated by a faint, phosphorescent glow that emanated from the walls themselves, a light that was not natural but was biological, produced by organisms that had evolved in darkness and had developed their own sources of illumination. The chamber was filled with structures that were not natural, not geological, but were artificial, constructed, the product of intelligence and intention. They were bones arranged in patterns that were geometric, architectural, the skeletons of creatures that were not human and not animal but were something else, something that had been assembled from the remains of many different species into configurations that suggested not death but design. There were skulls that were too large to be human, vertebrae that were too numerous to belong to any known animal, limbs that were jointed in directions that violated anatomy. And in the center of the chamber, arranged in a circle that was precise and deliberate, were the bodies of Dubois and Nakamura. They had not been killed quickly. The creature had taken its time with them, had evaluated them, had judged them, and had disposed of them according to a logic that was alien and terrible and absolutely thorough. Dubois was suspended from the ceiling by his own intestines, which had been extracted through a hole in his abdomen, and tied to a stalactite above, leaving him dangling like a puppet with its strings cut, his face frozen in an expression that was not pain but was something else, something that looked almost like relief. Nakamura was on the floor, his body arranged in a posture that was simultaneously fetal and crucified, his limbs bent at angles that were anatomically impossible, his spine twisted into a spiral that suggested not violence but deliberation, not destruction but creation. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, and his mouth was open too, as if he had been trying to speak when he died, as if he had something to say that would never be heard. "Oh God," Alan whispered, and the words were a prayer, a plea, a cry for help that he knew would never be answered. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." He moved through the chamber, his eyes averted from the bodies, his mind focused on the passage that he could see on the far side, a tunnel that sloped upward that led toward the surface, that offered the possibility of escape. He climbed over the remains of the creature's previous victims, the bones and the bodies and the debris of millennia of predation, and he reached the tunnel, and he began to climb. The slope was steep, the walls close, the darkness absolute. He climbed with his hands and feet, finding purchase in cracks and crevices, pulling himself upward with a strength that was the product of desperation rather than fitness. He climbed until his muscles burned, until his lungs screamed, until his mind was empty of everything but the need to move, to ascend, to escape. And behind him, always behind him, came the scraping, the clicking, the rhythmic sounds of the creature's presence, its attention, its patience. It was letting him climb, letting him escape, letting him reach the surface. And Alan understood, with a clarity that was both terrible and liberating, that the creature was not hunting him. It was using him. It was herding him toward the surface so that he could emerge, so that he could tell the world what he had seen, so that he could warn them about the gate and the guardians and the threshold that had been crossed. The creature wanted the world to know, wanted humanity to understand, wanted the fear to spread. Because fear was its food, fear was its purpose, fear was the reason for its existence. And the more people who knew about it, the more people who feared it, the stronger it would become. Alan emerged from the tunnel into the alpine air, the cold wind striking his face with a force that was almost painful, the sunlight, the glorious, ordinary, beautiful sunlight, blinding him after hours of darkness. He fell to his knees in the snow, gasping, retching, his body rejecting the experience in the most literal way, and he looked back at the tunnel from which he had emerged, at the darkness that was still waiting, still watching, still patient. The sun was setting. The twin peaks of Mount Mashu were silhouetted against the orange sky, their limestone faces glowing with a color that was the color of blood, of fire, of warning. And standing atop the eastern peak, its massive form outlined against the dying light, was the Girtablilu. It had emerged from the mountain. It had climbed to the peak, and it was watching the valley below, the villages and towns and cities that lay in the darkness that was spreading with the sunset, the human habitations that were unaware of what had been released, what was waiting, what was coming. Alan watched it, his one good eye fixed on the silhouette that was both terrible and magnificent, and he understood, finally and completely, the horror of his survival. He had not escaped. He had been allowed to leave. The creature had marked him, claimed him, used him as a messenger, a herald, a warning sign posted at the edge of the territory that the Girtablilu now claimed as its own. And the gate was open, the threshold had been crossed, the change of shift was complete. The creature was no longer just guarding the entrance to the underworld. It was waiting for the sun to go down so that it could hunt in the valley below, so that it could purge the unworthy, so that it could fulfill its ancient function in a world that had forgotten why such guardians were necessary. Alan stood in the snow, the cold wind cutting through his clothing, his body trembling with exhaustion and shock and the aftermath of terror. And he screamed, a sound that was high and thin and utterly ineffectual, a cry of warning that would be heard by no one, understood by no one, heeded by no one. The Girtablilu turned its head, the silhouette of its massive form shifting against the orange sky, and it looked at him, or seemed to look at him, with an attention that was patient, eternal, and absolutely hungry. The night was coming, and the guardians were ready. The threshold of Mashu was open, and the world would never be safe again. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.